disaster. The commotion at the bow of the ship was loud but largely inconsequential. This was because a sword cultivator had summoned his bonded flying swords. Not one, but an abnormal two. Yet, not a single drop of blood had been spilled in the end. The onlookers were quite disappointed by this result. There were 200 or so passengers on the immortal ship, and many of them engaged in spirited discussions at this moment. To citizens of the Azure Phoenix Nation, it wasn't strange for all kinds of people to travel on immortal ships. There were official immortals traveling around the world, vagrant cultivators wandering around to seek fame and fortune, and officials and wealthy individuals bringing their families around to broaden their horizons. While traveling on the immortal ships, the passengers would eventually grow accustomed to the rolling sea of clouds and the sight of immortal cranes soaring through the sky. These beautiful sceneries would no longer appear as special as before. On the other hand, they would feel reinvigorated if they were able to personally witness a conflict like the one that had just taken place at the bow of the ship. The passengers all held their own views regarding the conflict, and compared to Chen Ping'an's nonchalance and the group of martial artists cowering, the passengers were much more spirited in their discussions of the conflict. Their views were quite complicated, but they were still able to reach a rough consensus in the end, concluding that the young sword cultivator was far too domineering in his response. The matter was very minor, so was it necessary for the young sword cultivator to lash out and injure the other party? He could have solved the problem simply by revealing that he was a sword cultivator, yet he had insisted on kicking the burly man so hard that he couldn't stand up afterward. Was this not a case of being too arrogant and overbearing? Only a little girl who was traveling around the world with her parents remarked in confusion. Didn't the injured martial artist provoke the sword cultivator first? However, including her parents who were a perfect match for each other among the wealthy clans of the Azure Phoenix Nation, all of the adults discussing the matter with excitement and vigor turned a deaf ear to her naive remarks. They continued to speculate the identity of the young sword cultivator, trying to figure out whether he was from Li Tuanjing's Wind Lightning Field, Sun Scorch Mountain that was soaring with sword chi, or some other force. Upon hearing this, the little girl timidly said, "If that big brother dressed in white and carrying a sword on his back wasn't strong enough, then wouldn't he have already been bullied and beaten up by that big group of people?" The adults once again ignored the naive remarks of this little child. After all, what could a little child like her understand? The little girl was slightly angry about being ignored by everyone, so she ran to a section of the railings near the bow where there were relatively fewer people. She stood on her tippy toes and gazed into the distance, feeling like the clouds in the sky were the biggest and fluffiest balls of cotton candy in the world. This made her crave some cotton candy, so she reached out with her little hand and pretended to grab the large clouds, after which she pretended to stuff them into her mouth. She then patted her belly in satisfaction, no longer feeling angry at those adults. In reality, she wanted to look for that tan little girl who was around the same age as her to play with. However, she had felt a little shy before, and her parents had also warned her that she couldn't be as carefree on this immortal ship as she was at home. Following the conflict between the young sword cultivator and the group of martial artists, the little girl was even less daring to go over and look for the tan little girl. At this moment, the little girl suddenly noticed an extremely handsome man standing in front of the railings nearby. In fact, he was even more handsome than the big brother who had protected the tan little girl just then. The handsome man was around 30 years old, yet the impression that he gave others was still a little fuzzy. He still appeared young and full of vigor. He turned around and caught the little girl's gaze, causing the latter to hurriedly turn around and pretend that she was enjoying the scenery. The handsome man smiled before copying the little girl's action from before, reaching out at a mountain-shaped cloud near the immortal ship. The snow-white cloud trembled slightly, and a white thread that dazzled with brilliance under the sunlight immediately hovered into the handsome man's palm. He used his hands to roll the thread into a ball, after which he smiled and offered it to the little girl, seemingly asking her whether she wanted to have a taste. The young girl vigorously shook her head, so the handsome man tossed the white ball into his own mouth. The little girl gasped in admiration. "This person is a handsome immortal." The handsome man was bored with nothing better to do as he leaned on the railing. He had taken leave and gone on this trip for two reasons. Firstly, he wanted to relax and clear his mind. Secondly, he wanted to observe from up close that young man who was very likely from the same teaching as him. This handsome man was none other than Chief Military Governor Wei Liang of the Azure Phoenix Nation. He was the person who had fomented the plan to encircle the Yellow Earth Bull in order to draw out the vagrant cultivators and kill them, and he was also the gatekeeper for the capital during the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism. In reality, the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism was yet to truly finish, so Emperor Tang Li had been extremely reluctant to give Chief Military Governor Wei Liang his requested leave. Wei Liang was even older than the Azure Phoenix Nation, and he was once a trusted subordinate of the founding emperor, and also the chief strategist in the past. With the situation in the capital as complicated as could be at this moment, it would feel as if there were voracious tigers and wolves lying around the emperor's bed if Wei Liang wasn't present. Even so, Emperor Tang Li had no option but to grit his teeth and agree to Wei Liang's request. After the Azure Phoenix Nation was founded, the founding emperor of the nation constructed pagodas and commissioned paintings for each of the 24 founding ministers who had provided outstanding service. Wei Qian wasn't ranked very high among the 24 ministers, yet the 23 other ministers had already passed away. In fact, even the great-great-grandchildren of these ministers had already passed away. Meanwhile, Wei Qian had merely changed his name to Wei Liang. The immortal ship they were on was called Azure Garb, and its exterior appearance was no different from the battleships of mortal empires that sailed across giant lakes and large rivers. The immortal ship wasn't quick, and it would also take detours so that the passengers could disembark and visit the immortal mountains along the way to entertain themselves. There was the fishing platform that soared above the clouds, and one could use special fishing rods refined from unique wood to fish for sparrows and flying fish that were worth an exorbitant amount of money. There was the lofty mountain peak with countless inns where one could enjoy the magnificent sight of sunrise and sunset. There was some immortal force where they could spend a small fortune to purchase seeds, following which they could hand the seeds to agrarian cultivators and have them raised into all kinds of strange and wonderful plants to decorate their residences with or use as elegant bribes. There were also some mountains that purposely raised immortal beasts, and wealthy guests could enter these mountains and be accompanied by cultivators the entire time. While in the mountains, the wealthy guests could traverse mountains and cross rivers and face all kinds of dangers to capture the immortal beasts. Wei Liang had a colorful history in the Azure Phoenix Nation, yet in reality he had been single and alone the entire time. Several weddings had been held in the chief military governor's office, yet all of them had guises to deceive others. Thus, Chief Military Governor Wei Liang didn't have any offspring. In the blink of an eye, so many years had already passed. Wei Liang squatted down and asked with a smile, "What's your name, little girl?" The little girl hesitated for a moment before replying, "My name is Yuan Yinshu." Wei Liang nodded and said, "Speech with substance and speech with cogency, by the looks of it. A senior in your family was once an admirer of the Tongqing school's Zifa philosophy. However, this literary school has already fallen silent for many years. That being the case, I surmise that it wasn't your father who chose your name, but instead your grandfather. Am I correct?" The little girl's eyes widened in astonishment, and she felt even greater admiration for this handsome man. He had even managed to guess this? Wei Liang smiled and suggested, "Why don't we have a chat?" Yuan Yinshu jogged over and squatted down beside him, saying, "Please go ahead, mister, I'm listening." In the distance, there was a look of anxiousness on the face of the little girl's mother, and she was just about to walk over to bring her daughter back. Her husband was an elegant middle-aged scholar, and he was also planning to bring his daughter back. After all, no one on an immortal ship would be simple. However, the old guest elder from their clan accompanying them on this trip shook his head at the middle-aged scholar, saying in a quiet voice, "Perhaps this is a fated opportunity pertaining to immortals from the mountains. It's best that we stay put and observe the situation." Only after hearing this did Yuan Yinshu's parents feel slightly more at ease. At the same time, they also felt a slight sense of anticipation. Wei Liang decided to sit down and cross his legs, placing his palms on his knees. The immortal ship sailed over a blanket of clouds, making it look like they were sailing through a snow-white river. It was as if they were genuinely sitting on an ordinary ship traveling through some river. Wei Liang first asked Yuan Yinshu for her thoughts about the conflict that had taken place at the bow of the ship just then, and the little girl revealed her honest thoughts to the handsome man. Yuan Yinshu felt a little happy when she saw the immortal nod in approval. There was finally someone who agreed with her opinions. Wei Liang's voice was slow as he said, Little children like you who have had little interaction with the world are, how should I say this? You're like the most beautiful yet most fragile porcelainware in the world. Whether this porcelainware becomes a centerpiece in an elegant hall, or whether it transforms into a cracked jar by a well, this all depends on whether one is educated and brought up properly. If one's education and upbringing are good, then one will be shaped into a wonderful piece of art. If the opposite is true, then one will end up crooked and astray. Teaching is accomplished through words and deeds, with the latter being more important than the former. Teaching through words is theoretical, while teaching through deeds is practical. This is especially the case since children won't necessarily understand the principles being expounded by their elders. However, children are most curious about the world around them. Thus, it's extremely difficult for children to listen to and remember the principles being taught to them. On the other hand, children see many things with their eyes, allowing them to more easily gain a rough understanding of the world through their observation. Even so, their understanding is still shallow and relatively black and white. This is childish yet precious. As children grow up, they'll be oblivious to the gradual change that's taking place inside them, little by little, year by year. The worldview in their mind will gradually solidify, and this is a view that will be incredibly difficult to change in the future. That's why it sometimes appears like adults are acting in a mysterious manner that's completely out of character for them, yet in reality, there would have been clues and signs all along. The speech and actions of a child's parents are fundamentally important in the early stages of a child's life. Perhaps a parent might miss the mark when scolding their child for doing something wrong, or a parent might directly turn a blind eye to their child's mistake and dismiss it as a result of their child being too young. In the end, however, is this not a case of harming others, harming themselves, and harming their children? Parents should learn how to establish rules for their children. Benevolence and righteousness are the most important characteristics of reason, while punishment and penalties are the least important characteristics of reason. Wei Liang spoke in a calm and unhurried manner. Yuan Yenshu listened carefully, and she occasionally blinked her eyes as she looked at the handsome immortal speak. As such, when children are still young, parents should use their deeds and actions to teach them the principles of benevolence and righteousness. Wei Liang continued. When the children are slightly older, teachers should educate them and expound the principles of benevolence and righteousness according to the sagely texts. The two should complement each other, with parents teaching their children in a practical manner and teachers elevating the knowledge of the children. Both are indispensable, and the two being in opposition is even worse. Yuan Yenshu remained silent the entire time, and it was unknown whether she understood Wei Liang's words or not. Regardless, the little girl understood that she should listen carefully and not interject when other people were speaking. Wei Liang looked at her and asked with a smile, "Do you know what kind of person is more willing to listen to other people speak reason?" Yuan Yenshu shook her head. Wei Liang answered his own question saying, "In the beginning, children listen to their parents. Afterward, they become students who listen to their teachers. When they grow up, they'll enter a world where the weak listen to the strong, the poor listen to the rich, the subjects listen to their emperor, those outside the mountains listen to those in the mountains, and those in the mountains listen to those at the peak." However, a new problem then arises. What if the strong are incorrect, yet the weak loyally hold their words as gospel? What can we do then? At that time, the principles of morality and righteousness will already have little effect. Thus, it becomes necessary to have law. There needs to be something in the world that's even loftier than all of the immortal techniques in the mountains, something that can command even more respect, something that can restrain even the so-called strong individuals. This is something that can make the strong cower like disobedient children who are being scolded by their parents. It can make them feel pain like a student who has done wrong and is being struck on the palm by their teacher's ruler. There was a dazzling smile on Wei Liang's face as he asked, "You don't entirely understand this, right?" Yuan Yenshu naturally didn't understand this, with her little brain completely muddled as she nodded and replied, Wei Liang laughed and said, "In reality, you've already committed my words to memory, and it's just that you don't understand them for the moment. However, the fact that you've accepted my words and committed them to memory already makes you more impressive than many adults. After suffering losses, many adults only learn some small tricks that help them in trifling mortal relationships. Little girl, even though your cultivation aptitude is nothing special, your family circumstances are good, and there's no need for you to worry about food or shelter. As such, it's unlikely that you'll encounter an event that will significantly alter your personality and character. You can marry a good man in the future, and you won't suffer many hardships in your life. Yuan Yinshu felt a little embarrassed. She had indeed played house and conducted mock weddings with her friends before, and they would find a piece of red cloth to place on the head of the bride each time. If her husband were the little bookworm from the Liu clan next door, then she would smile more as they carried out the mock wedding ceremony. If it were the little fatty from the Ma clan, however, she would be completely unwilling to smile. Wei Liang raised a finger and said, "Seeing that you're so clever and sensible, here's one more thing for you to keep in mind. When you grow up, if you face a huge challenge that you feel like your clan can't overcome, remember to visit the Chief Military Governor's office located in the southern region of the capital. You can look for someone called Wei Liang there. If the matter is urgent, you can simply send a letter to the Chief Military Governor's office. Mister, that will be something very far away in the future, won't it? Maybe we should forget about this." Yuan Yinshu replied in a timid voice. Wei Liang shook his head and said with a smile, "You shouldn't think. Time flows like rushing water, and you'll be all grown up in the blink of an eye. Another blink of the eye. And perhaps you'll have already died from old age." However, Wei Liang naturally didn't speak these inappropriate words. He smiled faintly and continued, "If kind-hearted people are harassed by others, should they stop being kind-hearted people? When sinister people are challenged by other sinister people, will they change their ways and stop being sinister people? There's a saying that noble people can be deceived through means within reason. However, does this mean that deceiving noble people is correct? Of course not. It's far too difficult to simply categorize people as good or bad. Even if we have proper definitions of what's correct and what's incorrect, it still remains a huge challenge to determine what the consequence of each action should be. Take for example the commotion that took place at the bow of the ship just then. If that young man with a sword on his back had remained calm and patiently explained the principles and reasons to those people, do you think they would have listened? Perhaps they would nod and agree on the surface, but would they truly agree in their minds? That being the case, what difference does it make whether he explains the principle and reasons or not? At the end of the day, those people weren't willing to listen to the genuine principles and reasonings. Instead, they were only willing to respond to their changing circumstances. Once the two sides parted ways and their circumstance returned to normal, would their personality have changed at all? Naturally not. A leopard can't change its spots, and those people will continue to conduct themselves in the same manner as always. If the young man with a sword on his back had instead chosen to sit down and expound his principles and reasoning, then that might have provoked those people even further and caused them to eventually develop killing intent. Forget about it, let's not talk about these things. Looking at the sea of clouds and enjoying the view here is far more relaxing. In reality, Wei Liang was speaking to himself more than he was speaking to Yuan Yinshu. He certainly didn't expect her to understand anything either. Truth be told, there would be little difference even if Wei Liang were speaking to Yuan Yinshu's parents instead of the little girl herself. It wasn't that they wouldn't understand him, but rather that they would feel was only normal. This was how the world worked after all. Thus, rather than discussing these things, it might be slightly more realistic to discuss some absurd ideas and mystical principles that were already far enough detached from reality. Wei Liang had become an earth immortal more than 200 years ago. Yet for the sake of promoting his own teachings, he had decided to use the transformation of a nation's people and customs to act as his Tao observation and Tao attainment catalyst. As such, he had used the pseudonym of Wei Qian and traveled to the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile continent back then, assisting the founding emperor of the Azure Phoenix nation to build up his country. Afterward, Wei Liang had assisted many generations of emperors to establish the rule of law. Before the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism, he had never used his power as an earth immortal to target the officials and cultivators in the Azure Phoenix nation either. Because of this, his job was not only tiresome and time-consuming, but progress was also extremely slow. In fact, a lot of his previous work had also been undone during the rule of two different emperors. This had greatly disappointed Wei Liang. In the end, Wei Liang smiled and left, simply reminding the little girl to keep secret his mention of the letter as well as the chief military governor's office. Only after Wei Liang disappeared did Yuan Yanxu's parents and the guest elder from the clan walk over to the little girl's side, asking her about the contents of her discussion. Yuan Yanxu didn't dare to conceal too much, but she had initially wanted to honor her agreement with that handsome man and keep secret his comments regarding the letter and the chief military governor's office. However, she accidentally slipped up, and the old guest elder from her clan astutely picked up on her comments. Her parents and the guest elder interrogated her with warm expressions and hidden motives, and Yuan Yanxu battled with herself for a long time before ultimately acquiescing to her parents' relentless questioning and revealing everything that was said. The old guest elder was delighted, and he chatted quietly with the little girl's father, saying that the man from just then was definitely a guest elder and cultivator from the chief military governor's office. Perhaps he was even a favored subordinate of Chief Military Governor Wei. The Yuan clan had struck fortune. The old guest elder reminded the middle-aged scholar, Yuan Yanxu's father, that the temper of immortals from the mountains was often unconventional and unpredictable. They couldn't be viewed through ordinary lenses. Thus, it was critical that he didn't gild the lily and visit the chief military governor's office to thank the man or whatnot. That was sure to backfire, and it was best that the Yuan clan pretended to not know anything. Yuan Yanxu's parents were extremely thrilled and emotional. However, the little girl felt a strong sense of guilt for having betrayed that handsome immortal, and she couldn't help but feel a little downcast as she squatted beside the railing. Already far away in the distance, Wei Liang sighed softly in response. This was a trivial matter, so Wei Liang wasn't necessarily disappointed by the outcome. He certainly wouldn't break his promise to the little girl because of this either. However, there was nothing to be pleasantly surprised by. In the future, Wei Liang would still assist the Yuan clan, a second-rate clan in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. One time, even if they failed to deliver a letter to the chief military governor's office. However, the little girl called Yuan Yanxu had already lost a fated opportunity, one that would have allowed her to embark on the path of cultivation. Even so, Wei Liang was aware that this wasn't necessarily a bad outcome for Yuan Yanxu. After all, it was already difficult enough to enjoy a peaceful life in this world. Things would be very different after entering the mountains and becoming a cultivator, and this was especially the case once one started to challenge the heavens. Disregarding the good and evil of other people, those who didn't have a strong enough resolve would often suffer miserable deaths. Qian Ping'an held Pei Qian's hand and returned to his room on the immortal ship. In an extremely rare display, Pei Qian surprisingly said that she was going to transcribe an extra 500 characters today. Qian Ping'an didn't stop her, and he simply reminded her that the extra characters she transcribed today wouldn't count towards the quota for tomorrow. Pei Qian stood straight and puffed her chest out, replying that she naturally understood this. She placed the miniature yellow gourd beside her hand as she transcribed the characters. Qian Ping'an sat opposite her, and continued to read a legalist book that he had purchased following Cui Dongshan's suggestions. This wasn't a rare or valuable book, but could be regarded as a so-called proper scripture that acted as a foundation for the 3 teachings and the 100 schools of thought. Lu Tai had given Qian Ping'an some suggestions regarding the act of reading, and Qian Ping'an had committed all of these suggestions to memory. For example, one needed to read and understand a broad range of books before summarizing everything into a few common principles. One also needed to follow the clues to uncover the truth. In terms of choosing the correct books to read, one shouldn't have the biased view that the 100 schools of thought were a hodgepodge of theories and principles with an endless sea of scriptures. In reality, even the 3 teachings in Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, the most widespread teachings in the world, weren't exempt from this problem. Only fewer than 50 books in total could be regarded as genuinely beneficial to the reader. In other words, even the elderly mortals in the world could read these books in great detail and reread them again and again. Because of these considerations, Qian Ping'an had only chosen 3 legalist books and made sure that there were no print issues that affected their contents. After making a mistake, her first reaction was to sincerely apologize to the burly man. In addition, the Pei Qian of today was completely different from the Pei Qian that Qian Ping'an had first encountered in the Lotus Flower-blessed land. For example, when experiencing the incident today, there had only been a single thought in Pei Qian's mind the entire time: transcribing texts. She hadn't turned around and cursed those people to a miserable death. Pei Qian, were you angry when that man grabbed your head and almost threw you aside? Qian Ping'an asked. Of course I was angry, Pei Qian exclaimed. When we were coming back, I cursed them to death in my mind. In fact, I gave each of those 8 baddies a different death. For example, the person whom Master punished accidentally tripped when walking out of his room and fell down the immortal ship, landing on the ground with a splat and becoming a pile of mush. That stinky lady who has big eye bags, according to the face-reading techniques that the old cook taught me, suddenly got into a fight with someone, and she ended up being slapped again and again, ultimately causing her to lose all of her teeth. Haha, and there was also that person with a pointy mouth and a monkey face. He got food poisoning, but there was no doctor on the ship to treat his ailment. In the end, he wailed in agony as he squirmed on the ground. Pei Qian was completely focused on transcribing texts, so she accidentally started to voice her true thoughts to Qian Pinyin. She suddenly jolted to her senses at this moment, and she said with a pained expression, "Master, whether it's a knuckle to the forehead or twisting my ears, do as you see fit." Qian Pinyin wasn't angry at her, and he asked with a smile, "Then what if?" As if predicting what Qian Pinyin was going to ask, Pei Qian sat up straight and said, "Rest assured, Master, I was only thinking about those things to amuse myself. Even if I master a peerless sword technique and an invincible fist technique one day, I won't genuinely abuse those people even if I come across them in the future. At most, I'll only kick them aside, similar to what Master did just then." "Why is that?" Qian Pinyin asked in curiosity. There was a look of righteousness on Pei Qian's face as she replied, "Because I'm Master's disciple. Not only that, but I'm also your opening disciple. That being the case, won't I be embarrassing my master if I stoop to the same level as them? In any case, that incident was quite minor, especially since I was kicked and bashed so many times when I was little. However, I'm a rich person now, and I can also be considered half a member of the cultivation world. So, I'm super generous and magnanimous now." Julien coincidentally walked in with Shiro at this moment, and he immediately raised a thumb and remarked, "Gallant heroine Pei Qian is becoming increasingly skilled at flattering other people now." Pei Qian continued to transcribe texts. She was in a very good mood today, so she decided not to argue with the old cook and lower herself to the same level as him. "Those people will definitely visit to apologize in a moment, so help me stop them and shoo them away." Qian Pinyin said to Julien, "Master, why don't you meet them and explain the principles and reasons to them?" Pei Qian suddenly asked. "You don't understand shit," Julien scoffed. Pei Qian surprisingly didn't retort him, and she instead grinned to herself in secret. When leaving the lion garden and walking along that small road back then, she had indeed grabbed a fart and asked Julien and Shiro to guess what was in her hand. So it was this old cook who truly didn't understand shit. Julien stood beside Pei Qian and watched her transcribing texts. She had most likely learned how to write from Qian Pinyin, and her handwriting could just barely be considered proper and legible now. As he watched the little girl transcribing texts in earnest, he explained, "If young master meets with those people and kindly explains the principles and reasons to them, they'll definitely nod and accept his teachings on the surface. They'll agree to never make the same mistake in the future. After turning around and leaving, however, they'll try to push their luck and might even treat their encounter with young master as something to be proud of. They'll tell everyone that they're acquainted with young master, and after disembarking the immortal ship, they'll continue to live their merry lives in the cultivation world. At that time they'll have a so-called sword cultivator friend, and everyone on this immortal ship can vouch that they're telling the truth. As such, will other people not feel apprehensive of them? Do you think this is a trivial matter?" Pei Qian looked up and asked in confusion, "How are they suddenly friends? Are we not enemies with each other?" Julien sat down and replied in a calm voice, "We know this, but the cultivation world doesn't know this." Pei Qian stopped writing, and she felt so angry that she slammed the table with her other hand as she exclaimed, "How is the cultivation world so screwed up? Focus on transcribing texts and aim to complete the task in a single go. It's best that you don't lose focus in the middle of the task." Qian Pinyin interjected with a smile. Pei Qian nodded in understanding before continuing to transcribe texts. Footsteps traveled over from the corridor outside, and the group of people mostly consisted of 3rd or 4th tier pure martial artists. There was only a single 5th tier martial artist. There was a knock on the door. Julien opened the door and immediately sent the door-knocking martial artist flying with a single kick. Piss off and don't come here to disturb my young master's peace and quiet. If anyone dares to come again, then I'll make sure to smack you to death." The group of martial artists was terrified, and they immediately bowed and apologized before scurrying off in fear. Almost half of the room doors along this corridor were open, and everyone was curious about whether this encounter would lead to conflict and bloodshed or end up as a so-called moving story that was praised and talked about by everyone in the cultivation world. However, the actual outcome left them slightly bored and disappointed. Even so, there were several vagrant cultivators who felt slightly better after seeing this outcome. After all, they would have felt incredibly jealous if the group of crude martial artists had truly managed to transform misfortune into fortune and become acquainted with this profoundly talented young sword cultivator. Looking at Qian Pingyan, who was quietly watching Pei Qian transcribe texts and judging whether she was making any mistakes, Shi Rou suddenly felt like she had wasted several hundred years of her life as a Yin entity. Wasn't Qian Pingyan yet to turn 20? That being the case, how was he so good at seeing through the intricate human mind? Qian Pingyan suddenly turned around and asked with a smile, "Is something the matter? You've been staring at me for half a day now." Shi Rou shook her head in slight embarrassment. However, she was afraid that Qian Pingyan had the wrong idea about the situation after seeing his strange expression, and she was worried that he was mistakenly thinking that she was having impure thoughts about him. Shi Rou became increasingly uneasy, and she suddenly stood up after a while and turned around to leave. Qian Pingyan was completely stumped. He had goosebumps after being stared at by Du Mao for so long. Zhu Lian was extremely amused and he chuckled. "Young master is truly a dragon among men. After coming across someone as impressive as young master, all of the women in the world are bound to fall head over heels for you and be unable to marry anyone else." Qian Pingyan sighed and said, "Zhu Lian, sometimes your words of flattery are truly inferior to Pei Qian's." "That's inevitable," Zhu Lian said with a chuckle. "After all, Pei Qian is innately talented at sucking up to others, while this old servant has needed to work hard to hone this skill." Pei Qian continued to transcribe texts, and she didn't so much as glance up as she exclaimed with an angry expression, "Just you wait, old cook, I still have 125 characters until I finish, so prepare yourself and get ready to face my wrath." Zhu Lian smiled and replied, "Oh? What are you going to do? Are we going to have a shit-eating competition? Or are we going to have a cursing competition?" Qian Pingyan couldn't bear to listen on, so he decided to retrieve the incredibly valuable day and night wandering deity true body talisman as well as the Dragon Palace jade pendant. Li Baozhen had unlocked these treasures, and Qian Pingyan didn't know how to lock them back up. As a result, spiritual energy continued to drain from the talisman and the jade pendant. However, the speed and amount of spiritual energy drain were almost negligible compared to the total amount of spiritual energy contained by the two treasures. It was as if someone had used a hoe to dig out a small ditch next to the large lake surrounded by a thicket of reeds outside the lion garden. At the same time, this also highlighted the significant shortcomings of talismans created by pure martial artists. The talismans created by pure martial artists were like boiling oil in a wok, and like the 4 ever-cycling seasons, they would become useless if they weren't used in a timely manner. Meanwhile, the talismans created by qi refiners would be like flowing streams and like immortal abodes. They would remain fresh and full of energy, even if they were left unused for a long time. Zhang Clan clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "I'm unable to see anything special about the jade pendant, but this precious talisman from the second young master of the Li clan can probably be regarded as an immortal treasure among immortal treasures?" Qian Pingyan nodded and replied, "The talisman branch is a major branch of the Taoist sect, and the myriad of transformations created by them all adhere to the heavenly secrets. After mastering their talismans, cultivators will be able to travel around the world without fear. Even if one comes across powerful sword cultivators who consume the most wealth and possess the strongest destructive ability, one will still be able to use dry well talismans and sword-suppressing talismans to target their foes. This is already a very good outcome compared to other qi refiners who fear sword cultivators like prey fear their predators. In any case, one can also use talismans to suppress ghosts and deities, so generally speaking, ordinary cultivators will all carry a few talismans with them just in case they come across any such danger. As for the amount and the quality of the talismans they carry, this naturally depends on how deep their pockets are. Chen Ping'an noticed Zhu Lian staring at him. Apart from using gold ink to draw talismans, Chen Ping'an had also used a large stack of precious high-grade talismans during the battle in the Lion Garden. Chen Ping'an smiled and said, "Regarding the stories behind this, I'll tell them to you and Pei Qian after we arrive at Downtrodden Mountain in the Dragon Spring Prefecture. Simply put, the existence of those talismans was the main reason why I didn't kill Li Baozhen." Zhu Lian didn't inquire any further, and he rubbed his hands and asked, "Young master, why don't you give me an opportunity to act as your training partner and spar with you?" Chen Ping'an nodded and stood up, replying, "Zhu Lian, you can go harder on me this time. And there's no need to worry about me not being able to handle your power. You didn't see how I sparred back then, and if you did, you would understand that Zheng Dafeng was truly going easy on you guys back in Old Dragon City's dust medicinal shop. To borrow your words, he was being extremely gentle, as if he were a man drawing eyebrows for a woman." Zhu Lian smiled and said, "I see. I felt quite unsatisfied back then, but with Sui Yubian present, it didn't feel right for me to complain." Pei Qian had already completed her transcriptions for the day. "You should go back to your room. Otherwise, you'll definitely yelp in astonishment in a moment," Chen Ping'an said. "I won't," Pei Qian promised loudly. Chen Ping'an first retrieved a cleansing talisman and stuck it on a wall. After 15 minutes, Pei Qian was already drenched in sweat merely from watching the two of them spar. Things were truly intense, and in the end, she decided to run to the corner of the room and open up Chen Ping'an's bamboo bookcase, retrieving her treasure box. If she were also required to practice fist techniques to fulfill her dream of becoming a peerless elite, then Pei Qian would definitely pretend that the cultivation world didn't exist. There was no cultivation world, and she could simply read stories about this mythical place in the novels. Chen Ping'an was wearing his Dao robe, golden sweet wine right now, and this saved him a lot of trouble. Following the conclusion of their sparring session, Chen Ping'an and Zhu Lian returned to the table and sat down. Chen Ping'an retrieved a pot of wine that he had purchased from the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, and poured a cup for Zhu Lian. Zhu Lian downed the wine in a single gulp, and he didn't need Chen Ping'an to refill his cup for him. Instead, he directly grabbed the pot of wine and poured another cup for himself. "Old cook, you shouldn't drink so much," Pei Qian warned Zhu Lian. "Drinking too much is harmful to the body. In any case, this wine costs 3 taels of silver a pot." Zhu Lian started to sip the wine slowly, and he asked in a quiet voice, "Young master, when do you plan to break through the barrier and advance to the 6th tier?" Chen Ping'an had made a decision about this a long time ago, so he replied, "I'll wait and see. There's a fated opportunity that I can fight for." Chen Ping'an didn't explain what the fated opportunity was. After all, the notion of strongest was even more elusive and intangible than the manifestation of a nation's martial fortune. He smiled and continued, "If I were told to enter those shattered blessed lands and mystical realms to try my luck and fight for fated opportunities and immortal treasures, hoping to find all kinds of inheritances and relics left behind by the immortals, I wouldn't really dare to do so. However, relying on his fists to strengthen the foundation of his martial Tao, Chen Ping'an felt was well worth a try. However, Chen Ping'an knew that as long as Chao Ci was still at the 5th tier, he along with everyone else would have no hope of becoming the so-called strongest. Ning Yao was slightly disgruntled and unwilling to accept this at the time. Chen Ping'an had just lost 3 fights in a row to Chao Ci at that time, so he hadn't thought much about Chen Qingdu's statement. However, Ning Yao had already been seething with anger. Chen Ping'an had felt quite happy upon seeing Ning Yao's reaction, yet his satisfied smile had caused Ning Yao to become even angrier. At this moment, Zhu Lian instinctively said, "Young master is someone who enjoys tremendous fortunes, so how is it possible for you to enter a treasure mountain but return empty-handed? This old servant is at the Vajrabadi tier, so I at least have some slight understanding of the mystical realms formed from shattered blessed lands. I'm aware that cultivators at the upper 5 tiers can't enter these mystical realms, and if they dare to do so, the mystical realms will become unstable and prone to collapse. The mystical realms might be enveloped by the chaotic river of time, and severely erode one's cultivation base. If there are no cultivators at the upper 5 tiers coveting your treasures, and if this old servant is also present to assist you, then young master can indeed enter some mystical realms to try your luck. The next time we come across a mystical realm, Young master can feel free to bring me along and venture inside. After all, pure martial artists aren't subject to the same restrictions, so doing so won't cause any trouble. Chen Ping'an pondered for a moment before nodding and saying, "That sounds reasonable. I've fallen into the habit of avoiding these places, but thinking about it now, it's about time that I change my mindset." Pei Qian had immediately furrowed her brows in anger upon hearing Zhu Lian claim that Chen Ping'an was someone who enjoyed tremendous fortunes, and only after hearing his subsequent remarks did her expression gradually become calm. There was a look of contemplation on Zhu Lian's face. In the days afterward, everything was calm and peaceful on the immortal ship. Many famous landmarks run by immortal forces from the mountains weren't wealthy enough to construct immortal ferry stations that would continually drain immortal money, and as a result, the immortal ship was unable to dock at these landmarks. However, the immortal ship had prepared some immortal boats that could hover in the sky and travel on the wind, allowing passengers to disembark the immortal ship and travel to those smaller ferry stations. An especially large number of passengers disembarked the immortal ship when they sailed past the renowned fishing platform, located in the northern region of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Chen Ping'an, Pei Qian, and Zhu Lian also walked to the bow of the ship, where they saw a vast sea of clouds drifting between two majestic mountains like a flowing river. There were two fishing platforms facing each other, with one located on each peak that was towering into the clouds. From time to time, they could see some colorful birds spreading their wings and slicing through the sea of clouds, after which they arced through the sky and dived back into the clouds. Pei Qian was engrossed by this, and she was extremely annoyed at the fact that she couldn't soar through the air and swoop over with her hiking pole in hand, smacking those birds and flying fish and dragging them back to the immortal ship. They could most likely fetch a good price, and if made a few more trips, she could potentially buy a new treasure box or even a treasure shelf. Zhu Lian was an 8th-tier martial artist, yet he only ever traveled on foot when accompanying Chen Ping'an on his distant journey. He had never soared through the sky before. Chen Ping'an was quite curious about this and he asked, "Zhu Lian, have you never thought about flying before? Don't you feel like you're wasting your cultivation base?" Zhu Lian shook his head and replied with a smile, "Young master, this old servant already became tired of other people looking at me in shock and awe back in my hometown. I truly can't bring myself to act in such a rash and hot-headed manner anymore." Shuro stood beside them and quietly took in the beautiful scenery. She was already accustomed to Zhu Lian's peculiar way of thinking, so she was no longer surprised by his words. While Chen Ping'an and his companions were enjoying the scenery, Wei Liang was sitting behind a table in his room and writing something. There was an antique-style rosewood box resting beside his hand, inside of which was a large collection of paper-cutting knives that could be regarded as the weapons of a noble person. Wei Liang retrieved a bamboo paper-cutting knife from the box and used it as a paperweight. Even though Wei Liang had left the capital with the excuse of traveling around to relax his mind, he had actually been working on something the entire time. This matter wasn't strongly related to the Azure Phoenix Nation, but it couldn't be regarded as insignificant either. He was helping someone compile the grades of all official immortals in the Eastern Treasured Vial continent, and he needed to create a document that was both concise and to the point. Wei Liang created a draft where the official immortals were categorized into 9 different grades. The first grade was reserved for those at the immortal tier, the second of the upper 5 tiers. The second grade was reserved for those at the unpolished jade tier, the first of the upper 5 tiers. In addition, those who had made significant contributions toward the destruction of enemy nations, following the southward march of the Greatly Empire's heavy cavalry, could also be elevated to the second grade. The third grade was reserved for those at the nascent tier, or those who had made significant contributions toward the expansion of the empire by an area equivalent to one state. The fourth grade was reserved for those at the golden core tier. Following this pattern, the grading system went all the way down to the 9th and final grade. The specific method of grading cultivators was exceedingly complicated, and there wasn't a strict relationship between the cultivation base of cultivators and their final grading. This was because it was necessary to consider their contributions to the Greatly Empire, especially their contributions to the southward expedition of the Greatly Empire's heavy cavalry. Among these official immortals, the Dragon Spring Sword Sex Ruanqiong was the top-ranked cultivator among those in the second grade. At the same time, he was currently ranked first on this document that would be used as a record of merits by the Greatly Empire's Imperial Song clan in the future. Apart from the Dragon Spring Sword sect, there were also the two Militarian ancestral temples, the Wind Snow Temple and True Martial Mountain, as well as the two major sword sects, the Wind Lightning Field and Sunscorch Mountain. Ranked below these forces were the Great Li Empire's Palace of Eternal Spring, Dawn Cloud Mountain, the Light Breeze City's Sioux Clan, and so on. All of these forces needed 1 or 2 guaranteed spots on the record of merits. Moreover, their grades would definitely be very high. As for the cultivators who possessed peace and safety tablets issued by the Great Li Empire's Ministry of Justice, they would most definitely be included in the record of merits as well. Beyond this, cultivators who had expressed their loyalty to the Great Li Empire from very early on could also be included in the record of merits regardless of their background and irrespective of whether they were official immortals or vagrant cultivators. Wei Liang had spent the past while refining the details of this grading document, and it was necessary for that person to provide him with a large amount of intelligence for him to properly complete this task. In fact, this intelligence even pertained to the longevity of different nations and the life and death of various rulers. Wei Liang placed his calligraphy brush on the brush stand before standing up and slowly pacing around his room. Why was he willing to do this task? Due to the forces of the unstoppable trend, Wei Liang had no option but to pledge his allegiance to the embroidered tiger. In reality, with Wei Liang's temperament, he could have abandoned his more than 200 years' worth of planning and hard work in the Azure Phoenix Nation if Cui Chan had failed to persuade him. He could have traveled to another continent to start over again. For example, he could have traveled to the relatively lawless Complete Reed continent or the comparatively stable Parasol Leaf continent. With his experience in the Azure Phoenix Nation, it would have taken him just 100 or 200 years to get back on track. When Cui Chan personally traveled to the Azure Phoenix Nation, however, the first person whom he had visited was none other than Wei Liang. The two of them had engaged in an honest and frank discussion, and after Wei Liang learned of the general plan that Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan and the Imperial Court had for the Great Li Empire, he had eventually decided to cooperate with them. Cooperation, not subordination. Wei Liang hadn't made any compromises, nor had he attempted to negotiate a better deal. Similarly, Cui Chan hadn't doubted Wei Liang's sincerity at all. It was clear that Cui Chan was seeking more and aiming higher than Wei Liang. So the chief military governor eagerly awaited his success, and for that day to finally arrive. We'll etch the laws of the Great Li Empire into stone and erect them atop the mountains of the eastern treasured Vile continent. There was soaring ambition in Wei Liang's mind and a fervent look in his eyes as he arrived in front of the window. His ambition was even more impressive than the sea of clouds flowing between the two magnificent mountains. This was what great people needed to do to avoid wasting their lives and knowledge. Chen Ping'an had traveled on intercontinental ships 3 times in the past, so he knew that this immortal ship, Azure Garb, was already slow to begin with. Unexpectedly, however, the immortal ship took many detours along the north and northeastern border of the Azure Phoenix Nation, allowing many groups of passengers to disembark. After leaving the Azure Phoenix Nation, Chen Ping'an initially thought that the immortal ship could finally speed up. However, this was not the case, and the immortal ship continued to dock at many ferry stations in a vassal state located to the north of the lofty Sky Nation. In the end, it directly came to a hovering stop above the central mountain of the vassal at noon, with an announcement made to the passengers that they would rest here and continue their journey tomorrow morning. Passengers could disembark to enjoy the scenery on the central mountain, and there was coincidentally a rock gambling event that was held 4 times every year. As such, passengers could also take this opportunity to make some small bets and have some fun. It would naturally be best if they enjoyed great fortune and made a huge return on their investments. The lamplight rocks in the central mountain of the sky-holding nation were referred to as mini Dawn Cloud Mountains, and if one gambled correctly, they could use a few snowflake coins to obtain some high-grade lamplight rock essence. If the rock essence were as large as a fist, then one could become filthy rich in a single night. 10 years ago, a vagrant cultivator had used his entire savings of 26 snowflake coins to purchase a large block of lamplight rock that no one else fancied. In the end, however, the rock was cut to reveal fiery crimson lamplight rock essence that was worth an impressive 30 lesser heat coins. Of course, passengers could also choose to remain on the immortal ship to rest if they didn't want to disembark. Chen Ping'an was rendered speechless after listening to the explanation of a maidservant on the immortal ship. Chen Ping'an walked to the window after the maidservant left, and he glanced at the so-called central mountain of the sky-holding nation in the distance, not knowing whether to laugh or to cry. It was called Central Mountain, yet to say nothing of Cloud-Draped Mountain in his hometown, it couldn't even compare to Downtrodden Mountain, which was his private property. Indeed, Downtrodden Mountain was much more majestic than this so-called Central Mountain. Chen Ping'an and the others prepared to disembark, and they waited for the small immortal boats to return to bring them to the large and impressive Central Mountain of the sky-holding nation. While Chen Ping'an and his companions waited for a small immortal boat to arrive, the other passengers in the surroundings subconsciously moved out of their way. They didn't point and stare, but it was inevitable that they whispered to each other in hushed voices. After failing to gain an audience with Chen Ping'an, the so-called young sword cultivator, the group of martial artists had already disembarked and left with their tails between their legs, not daring to stay on the immortal ship for any longer. The passengers all had different thoughts about this. Official immortals, regardless of their age, mainly felt a strong sense of jealousy toward Chen Ping'an and his two bonded flying swords. However, they were able to conceal their feelings very well. Meanwhile, vagrant cultivators were extremely fearful of him. After discussing their thoughts with many people on the immortal ship, the wealthy mortal passengers were mostly of the opinion that sword cultivators were indeed as arrogant and domineering as the rumors said. Following the incident, the immortal ship was extremely respectful to Chen Ping'an and his companions, especially picking out a beautiful maidservant to occasionally knock on their doors and offer some immortal fruit. There was also a small pagoda called the Immortal Qi Hall on the immortal ship, and this pagoda was especially used to host esteemed guests of the immortal ship, allowing them to create valuable works of ink. Chen Ping'an had politely turned down the invitation and asked Zhu Lian to head over in his place. After waiting for a while, they stepped onto a small immortal boat that had glowing golden talismanic symbols inscribed on its hull, following which they were transported to the foot of the central mountain. There were few genuine worshippers in the mountain god temple, and the large majority of visitors in the central mountain were wealthy individuals from the sky-holding nation and guests from the cultivation world who had come here to gamble on rocks. The wealthy individuals from the mortal nation were accustomed to looking down on others, yet they would walk slower and speak softer whenever they came across someone who had stepped down from the small immortal boats. There were 3 incense providers belonging to different shrines of the central mountain on the immortal ship, and they had almost gotten into a fight with each other in order to win over more customers. The incense provider from the mountain god temple was the most short-tempered, while the incense providers from the Taoist temple located at the mountain waist and Buddhist temple located at the mountain foot spoke amiably on the surface, yet were actually launching hidden barbs in their words. In any case, the 3 incense providers each showed their wares and each won over some guests. After traveling to the immortal ship on the small immortal boats, they were all able to disembark with a group of passengers who were willing to visit the temples to offer incense. The steward of the immortal ship personally led the incense provider from the mountain god temple to Chen Ping'an and the others, introducing the 2 parties to each other. The incense provider remained amiable and smiling even after Chen Ping'an said that he had no intention of purchasing and offering incense for the moment, and he gave a huge spiel about how incredibly fortunate he would be if young Master Chen could simply visit the temple. When Chen Ping'an and the others stepped off the small immortal boat onto the central mountain, the incense provider still on the immortal ship stood beside the railing and furiously spat toward the ground. Zhu Lian smiled with squinted eyes and asked, "What do you say, young master? Should this old servant fly for the first time to reward this brave man?" Chen Ping'an waved his hand and replied, "This might be the only encounter we have in our entire lives. There's also no animosity between us, so why dwell on this and kick up a fuss?" "What's going on?" Pei Qian asked in curiosity. "Someone's pissing and shitting on your head. Hurry, look up," Zhu Lian replied with a chuckle. Pei Qian rolled her eyes in response. There was a street that specialized in rock gambling at the foot of the mountain, and there were dozens of shops of varying sizes located along the street. The shops were filled with gray lamplight rocks, with the smallest rocks measuring as large as a palm and the biggest rocks measuring as tall as a person and weighing upward 5,000 kilograms. These gigantic lamplight rocks were often the most valuable rocks in the shops. Lamplight rocks were a special local product of the sky-holding nation's central mountain, and the reason for their name was due to a legend about the highest quality lamplight rock essence being as bright red as blood and incredibly viscous yet pure. This rock essence would flicker like lamplight, and holding a piece of lamplight rock would allow one to deter sinister ghosts and spirits. Surprisingly, however, even Earth immortals would be unable to see through these rocks and determine their quality before they were split open. Qian Pingyan wasn't interested in these things, so he gave Pei Qian, Zhu Lian, and Shi Rou 10 snowflake coins each, allowing them to pick and split open some lamplight rocks. Meanwhile, he climbed the central mountain by himself, wanting to visit the mountain god temple at the mountain peak to take a look. They agreed to meet up at an inn located at the foot of the mountain during the evening. Pei Qian was a little hesitant, and she asked if she could not buy any lamplight rocks. Qian Pingyan smiled and pinched her cheeks, replying, "The 10 snowflake coins are yours now, so you can spend them however you want." Pei Qian nodded in understanding. After Qian Pingyan walked far away and started to climb the mountain, Pei Qian immediately jumped up in delight and bared her teeth, wildly unleashing her deranged demon sword technique in happiness. Zhu Lian had yet to finish wandering through the second shop when he bought a piece of lamplight rock that he liked the look of. After cutting it open, it was revealed that he had lost his gamble. Pei Qian was so angry that she almost fought him to the death. Zhu Lian pressed down on her head and allowed her to wildly flail about. Shi Rou held the 10 snowflake coins in her hand and examined the rocks carefully, wandering through shop after shop and frequently studying a rock for a long time before eventually putting it back down. She had examined many lamplight rocks, yet she was still yet to spend a single snowflake coin. "You're truly skilled at subsisting," Zhu Lian praised. Pei Qian walked beside Shi Rou, and each time she stared at a lamplight rock, it was as if she wanted to stick her eyes into the rock. Zhu Lian kicked Pei Qian in the backside several times, and he even jested that she only had eyes for material wealth. Not only that, but her eyes were even getting stuck on rocks now. Just how laughable was this? However, it wasn't long before Zhu Lian started to regret his decision of not following Qian Pingyan into the mountain. Shi Rou and Pei Qian truly showed outstanding perseverance as they wandered through the shops, and they not only insisted on visiting each and every shop, but they even made a point to examine each and every lamplight rock. Moreover, they would definitely stop and watch on if anyone bought a rock, and ask the shopkeeper to help slice it open. They would watch from the beginning to the end with serious expressions, and it was as if they cared more about the outcome than the actual customer who had spent an exorbitant amount of money to gamble on a piece of rock. Zhu Lian wasn't physically tired, but he was rather mentally exhausted. When Zhu Lian finally glanced up at the sky, he figured that it was almost time for young Master Qian to descend the mountain and arrive at the inn. Shi Rou finally bought a lamplight rock that was the size of her palm, parting with 2 snowflake coins as per the listed price. After the rock was sliced open, there was surprisingly a piece of bright red rock essence the size of a thumb resting inside. Even the shopkeeper was sincerely astounded by this. It wasn't that the lamplight rock essence was worth a lot, but rather that it was indeed very rare for such a small piece of lamplight rock to produce such a large amount of rock essence. Shi Rou smiled faintly, and she had no intention of selling the bright red and viscous lamplight rock essence. After leaving the shop, Pei Qian suddenly tugged on Shi Rou's sleeve and asked in a quiet voice, "Big sister Shi Rou, can you lend me 8 snowflake coins? You're not buying any rocks, so why do you need to borrow this money?" Shi Rou asked in curiosity. "I am going to buy a rock," Pei Qian replied with a serious expression. Shi Rou was even more puzzled and she asked, "We've already visited all of the shops and looked at so many rocks, so do you still remember which one you want to buy?" Pei Qian nodded earnestly in response. Shi Rou smiled and handed her 8 remaining snowflake coins to Pei Qian. Pei Qian took a deep breath and started to sprint down the street. Shi Rou and Zhu Lian exchanged a glance before quickly catching up with the little girl. They didn't know what Pei Qian was playing at. In the end, the two of them discovered Pei Qian standing in a large shop that had lamplight rocks of various sizes stacked as tall as a mountain. Standing in a corner, Pei Qian struggled mightily to extract a lamplight rock that was most likely too large for her to wrap her arms around. Even though people were unable to see through lamplight rocks, there was a history of several hundred years of mining and slicing open these rocks. In addition to this, there were also various factors regarding the mountain roots and veins that would affect the quality of the rocks. Add to that the rich experience of the shopkeepers gained from slicing open countless lamplight rocks. It was only natural that the appraisers working in each shop would have a fairly good idea of how much each rock was worth. They would inevitably make some mistakes, but such mistakes would usually be minor and infrequent. They would almost never make any big mistakes and allow their customers to walk away with a huge win. Because of this, some large lamplight rocks were very cheap, while some small lamplight rocks were surprisingly very expensive. Pei Qian was squatting down on the floor, and the large lamplight rock resting beside her feet was priced at 20 snowflake coins. This lamplight rock had already been sitting in the shop for more than 100 years, with no one interested in gambling on it the entire time. Pei Qian started to haggle with the shopkeeper, saying that she only had 15 snowflake coins to spend. She had worked hard for many years, and this was the entirety of her savings. The old shopkeeper found the little girl very amusing, and she didn't look like the child of a wealthy family at all, especially with how tan she was. Yet, she was in possession of 15 snowflake coins, which equated to 15,000 taels of silver in mortal currency. In other words, she could already be regarded as a wealthy individual in the prefectures of the sky-holding nation. In reality, the old shopkeeper felt like reducing the price to 15 snowflake coins was still acceptable. After all, his appraiser had privately estimated that this large rock was only worth 10 snowflake coins. Moreover, if he didn't sell it today, it was very possible that this lamplight rock would sit in his shop for another 100 years. At that time, this shop would have already been passed down to his grandson. However, the old shopkeeper still insisted on haggling with Pei Qian, with one asking for an unreasonable price and one making very unreasonable offers. They haggled for 7 or 8 minutes, and the old shopkeeper wanted to see what excuses and explanations the little girl could come up with in order to save 5 snowflake coins. In the end, the old shopkeeper laughed heartily and agreed to drop the price by 5 snowflake coins. However, what he saw was the tan little girl retrieving a large handful of snowflake coins and picking out 3 to put back into her sleeve. She then handed the remaining 15 snowflake coins to him. The old shopkeeper grimaced upon seeing this. "Young lady, that's a little disrespectful of you." Pei Qian smiled and played dumb. Shiro pretended to not recognize Pei Qian. Zhu Lian gave her a thumbs up and praised, as expected of young master's opening disciple. The old shopkeeper wasn't angry, and he instead felt mischievous little girl was very good at doing business. He smiled and asked, "Do you want the shop to open up the rock for you?" Pei Qian nodded and replied, "Yes, I'll open it here. Otherwise it will be too large and heavy for me to carry. According to your rules, lamplight rocks that cost under 20 snowflake coins can all be sliced open for free. In addition, it's up to the buyer's discretion whether they give a tip or not if they open up a valuable rock. Old mister, you can't get angry at me if I don't give you a tip in a while." The old shopkeeper was thoroughly amused as he nodded and agreed to the little girl's request. Pei Qian suddenly asked the old shopkeeper to hold on for a second, following which she turned around to look at Zhu Lian. As if in tacit understanding, Zhu Lian nodded and said, "We'll open the rock here. Young master isn't here, but I am." Pei Qian cocked her head and smiled brilliantly. She then suddenly turned around and waved her hand at the old shopkeeper, announcing, "Slice open the rock." After doing this, she returned the 3 remaining snowflake coins to Shiro, saying in a quiet voice, "I still owe you 5 snowflake coins, and I'll return them to you in the future." 15 minutes later, the entire street was stunned. Pei Qian had already been carrying a luggage sack diagonally across her body to begin with, and she was now walking along the street with a hefty new bag. Behind her, the old shopkeeper was beating his chest and stomping his feet in utter regret. That was an incredibly rare lamplight rock essence that would only appear once every 100 years. It was worth a whopping 3 grain rain coins. 1. Zhu Lian smiled with squinted eyes and held his hands inside his opposite sleeves as he walked behind the confidently swaggering Pei Qian. Shiro simply felt was inconceivable. Chen Ping'an coincidentally descended from the central mountain and arrived at the other end of the street at this moment. He was completely baffled when he saw Pei Qian swaggering over at the center of everyone's attention. Pei Qian immediately sprinted over upon seeing the familiar figure of her master, and she panted heavily as she screeched to a halt in front of him. Chen Ping'an smiled and asked, "What's going on? Was it Zhu Lian or Shiro who won their gamble?" Pei Qian simply smiled in response. Zhu Lian and Shiro walked over to the master and disciple, and the former chuckled and explained quietly, Young master, it was this money loser who spent 15 snowflake coins to open up a lamplight rock that contained lamplight rock essence worth at least 3 grain rain coins. Qian Ping'an smiled and patted Pei Qian's head, praising, "How impressive!" He was indeed happy, but he wasn't especially astonished or delighted. Pei Qian was smiling so widely that her eyes became squinted crescents. She cocked her head and removed the bag from her shoulder with some difficulty, handing it to Qian Ping'an and saying, "Master, this is a present for you." Qian Ping'an smiled and shook his hand, replying, "It's okay, you can keep it for yourself. When you save enough money to buy a treasure shelf in the future, you can place it at the top in the most eye-catching location. That will be quite good, and everyone will be envious of you when they see it. They'll all know that you're a rich young lady." Pei Qian shook her head vigorously, explaining, "I suddenly remembered that the day I caught the wild hare and released it again was coincidentally Master's birthday. So this is my birthday present to Master." Qian Ping'an was astonished, and he fell silent for a long time before placing a hand on Pei Qian's head. He also smiled so widely that his eyes became squinted in a rare display, and he replied, "Is that so? Then Master will accept it." This was the first time Zhu Lian had seen Qian Ping'an become so happy. Qian Ping'an had naturally been very happy when reuniting with Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia as well, but his type of happiness back then wasn't the same as his type of happiness right now. Pei Qian nodded and said in an apologetic voice, "But Master, I might not be able to give you such a nice birthday present on the 5th day of the 5th lunar month next year. Okay?" Qian Ping'an accepted the bag and placed it inside his bamboo bookcase. He then held Pei Qian's hand and walked along the street with her. Pei Qian was exuberant as she recounted the shocked reactions of everyone following her lamplight rock being sliced open to reveal the incredible rock essence. Qian Ping'an smiled faintly as he listened to Pei Qian excitedly recount the event. The sun dipped below the horizon. The lingering rays of sunshine elongated the shadows of the young man and the little girl. Zhu Lian continued to walk behind them with his hands inside his opposite sleeves, while Shiro watched on with a gentle look in her eyes. Qian Ping'an and the others had initially planned to stay at an inn located at the foot of the mountain, yet the inns were unexpectedly bursting with people, and it was often the case that the inns would only have one spare room at most. However, Qian Ping'an wasn't comfortable with this, and he was worried that just Shiro alone wouldn't be enough to protect Pei Qian. Because of this, they had no option but to take a small immortal boat back to Azure Garb, the immortal ship hovering in the sky. Zhu Lian asked Qian Ping'an about the mountain god temple located at the peak of the central mountain and how many incense offerings there were, to which Qian Ping'an replied that he hadn't entered the temple to offer incense and had only wandered around the peak of the mountain for a while. He had come across a few Taoist temples and Buddhist temples, and it was clear that they were pulling no stops to fight for worshippers. One Taoist temple had asked a high-ranking official of the sky-holding nation to erect a stone tablet outside the temple gates, while a Buddhist temple had asked a renowned calligrapher to create their plaque. Apart from this, the paths leading to the Taoist temples and Buddhist temples were also paved very nicely, with trees and greenery decorating the two sides. This was the case on one peak of the 5 mountains, so it was entirely natural that the competition for worshippers and incense offerings between the 5 mountains was even more intense. It could be said that the temples and mountains were using every possible means to win over worshippers. There was one mountain god of the 5 mountains who frequently invited chi refiners at the middle 5 tiers to build thatched cottages and cultivate on his mountain. Even if the chi refiners didn't turn up, the mountain god would be happy as long as their thatched cottages remained. As the saying went, mountains are renowned not for their height, but for the presence of immortals living in them. At the same time, this mountain god would also cordially invite scholars and literati to his mountain to enjoy the scenery and compose some works. Following this, the mountain god would then instruct people to spread the news of these events throughout the mortal empires and so on. The mountain god used a myriad of methods to promote their mountain. It was said that a renowned scholar and official of the sky-holding nation posthumously referred to as the banana scholar had once sheltered from rain on the southern mountain of the nation. While staying there, he had composed an extremely popular poem that was highly regarded by the assistant mountain master of Lakeview Academy, and eventually added to a poetry collection. Not only that, but it was included as the last and best poem of the collection. Because of this, The mountain god temple of the southern mountain was still enjoying the benefits of this event even after more than 100 years. Chen Ping'an didn't necessarily like these business tactics that had absolutely nothing to do with immortal characteristics. However, he didn't resent these practices either. In fact, he might even need to emulate these practices if he genuinely created his own force in his hometown of the Dragon Spring Prefecture one day. Chen Ping'an smiled and shook his head, replying, "Firstly, we haven't gone out to create trouble with anyone. Secondly, we're not incapable of defending ourselves against ill-intentioned individuals. Moreover, does it make sense for good people to bang on drums and gongs and guard against thieves every single night? If someone genuinely barges over with ill intentions, then it won't be too late for you to get rid of an evil for the people at that time." Shuro voluntarily spoke up in a rare change, saying, "But people are only itching to make a move because we possess such valuable treasures." Chen Ping'an remained patient and explained, "No, you're wrong. Firstly, coveting treasures and having thoughts of killing others to snatch their treasures is fundamentally wrong. Secondly, it might appear to be the case that we're guilty of the crime of possessing rare treasures, thereby inviting others to become jealous of us. However, this is untrue. Instead, what existed first was the evil inside these people's hearts. They've set their eyes on our lamplight rock essence today, and they might set their eyes on someone else's immortal treasures tomorrow. Day after day, they'll view the fortunes of others as their excuse to rush into danger and flagrantly disregard the laws." There was a notion of sequential order, and Chen Ping'an had already broken things down and explained them carefully. Shuro nodded in understanding and approval. In the end, Chen Ping'an smiled faintly and continued, "The cultivation world is already polluted enough, so let's not criticize and ask any more of the good people. The spring and autumn annals often criticize virtuous individuals and have incredibly strict requirements for them, but this is a case of the paramount sage setting strict standards with good intentions, and it isn't something that any random person in the future generations can blindly emulate." Julien smiled widely and asked Pei Qian, "Did you understand any of that?" Pei Qian glared at him and retorted, "What's it matter to you?" Julien clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "The money loser has finally turned her luck around and managed to earn a large sum of money in a rare turn of events, and this has made her backbone even stiffer and straighter than her hiking pole." The small immortal boat slowly rose into the sky. Pei Qian sat beside Chen Ping'an and tried her best to suppress her laughter. "Why didn't you buy some more lamplight rock to test your luck?" Julien asked. "For example, if the 3 snowflake coins weren't enough, you could have asked Shuro to sell her small piece of lamplight rock essence. That way, you could have used a small sum of money to gamble for a large sum of money. You could have earned more and more, and you could have raked in a mountain of gold and silver and become filthy rich on that street. To say nothing of a birthday present for your master this year, you might have earned enough to give him better presents for the next 2 years as well." Pei Qian raised 2 fingers with a smug expression. Julien smiled faintly and said, "Go on, I'm all ears." Pei Qian copied Chen Ping'an and said in a slow voice, "Firstly, when we were leaving the Lion Garden, Master taught me that a noble person seizes not the favored items of others. As such, I definitely won't ask Shuro to sell her lamplight rock essence. Secondly, one needs to show restraint in the cultivation world. It was also Master who taught me this." Julien cupped his fists and said, "Thank you for enlightening me, gallant heroine Pei. When is teacher Pei going to open a school to impart her knowledge? I'll definitely be there to support you." Pei Qian purposely threw a fist to frighten Julien. Yet upon seeing the old cook remain unfazed, she huffed and retracted her fist, asking, "Why are you so childish, old cook?" Julien threw a punch. Pei Qian instantly leaned back and dodged the punch before roaring with laughter. Julien and Chen Ping'an exchanged a smile. Shuro wasn't a pure martial artist, so she was oblivious to the mystical nature behind this exchange. They returned to the immortal ship, and most likely due to the rumor about the young sword cultivator possessing 2 bonded flying swords being far more terrifying than the allure of the 3-grain rain coins, not a single person dared to test the true skills of Chen Ping'an the entire time. In the end, the immortal ship slowly set off from the sky-holding nation. However, the immortal ship flew slowly and took many detours, and it also used all kinds of different methods to incentivize the passengers to spend. Chen Ping'an was genuinely impressed by their methods. On this day, the immortal ship stopped above another location, with numerous immortal boats being cast out like a net and sailing toward an immortal force where the passengers could walk across a so-called single-plank bridge. Even Chen Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle and say that they had truly boarded a pirate ship. This immortal force was only a third-rate force in the eastern treasured Vile continent, yet they had constructed a single-plank bridge that measured more than 5 kilometers in length between two mountain peaks. This bridge sat above the sea of clouds all year round, and the scenic view from the bridge was indeed quite good. However, the immortal force didn't hold back when it came to charging visitors, and a single trip along the bridge would set one back 3 entire snowflake coins. According to rumors, the upper 5-tier vagrant cultivator from Wasptail Ferry Station had once visited and walked across the single-plank bridge, coincidentally catching sight of the sun rising from the east while he was doing so. A flash of inspiration had hit him, allowing him to comprehend Tao and advance to the next tier. Indeed, it was on the single-plank bridge that he had become a golden core tier Earth immortal. Afterward, it was thanks to this fated opportunity that he had managed to climb to the peak of the eastern treasured Vile continent from his humble beginnings as a lowly vagrant cultivator. Chen Ping'an obediently retrieved 12 snowflake coins. In the beginning, Pei Qian had wanted to run back and forth along the bridge a good 7 or 8 times. However, a young woman who was fortunate enough to enter the mountains to cultivate smiled and reminded everyone that there was a unique rule regarding this single-plank bridge. That was, visitors weren't allowed to turn around and walk the other way. This caused Pei Qian to stomp her foot in frustration. She was losing money again, wasn't she? It was called a single-plank bridge, yet in reality, the bridge wasn't narrow or difficult to navigate at all. However, the bridge crossed by the vagrant cultivator from Wasptail Ferry Station had indeed been old and in bad condition. Afterward, the immortal force had scrounged together all of its funds to rebuild the single-plank bridge to its current state. Not only was it wide and stable, but it was also incredibly detailed and beautiful. The immortal ship set off again, taking a detour around the war-torn central region of the eastern treasured Vile continent. It traveled in a truly huge arc around the warring nations. In fact, it took such a huge detour that the land beneath them was none other than the Dragon Channel that Chen Ping'an had once traveled along during his southward journey on a ship. Back then, Chen Ping'an had parted ways with Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia and continued south by himself. This time he was accompanied by Pei Qian, Zhu Lian and Shi Rou. Apart from practicing fist stances while traveling on the immortal ship, Chen Ping'an had no option but to spend half of his time meditating and looking within himself. He needed to absorb spiritual energy to nurture his so-called water palace. The longer he cultivated, the more he understood the side effects of practicing both martial arts and qi refinement at the same time. Chen Ping'an came to the rough conclusion that things would temporarily be smooth sailing when he reached the 7th tier of martial arts and the 6th tier of qi refinement. Afterward, however, the conflict between the two would become increasingly irreconcilable, especially after he finished refining his bonded items and eventually formed a golden core. This would cause his martial arts journey to become increasingly bumpy. At the same time, it would also be incredibly difficult for him to advance to the nascent tier. However, this was a problem for the future. Right now, he still needed to practice fist techniques, and he still needed to try his absolute best to absorb and refine spiritual energy. After completing 1 million punches of the most elementary 6-step walking meditation at the Sword Qi Great Wall, Chen Ping'an had thrown close to 400,000 additional punches after leaving Stalactite Mountain and traveling to the Parasol Leaf Continent, then the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, the Great Quan Empire, Old Dragon City located in the southernmost region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, the Azure Phoenix Nation located in the southeastern region of the continent, and now to the Great Sway Nation in the north. Following the departure of the immortal ship, it was Lesser Heat, the 11th solar term right now, and this was a period leading into the scorching summer heat. At this moment, 3 elders climbed the mountain and arrived in front of the single-plank bridge. There were few visitors right now. Apart from the young women who were responsible for collecting entrance fees at the 2 ends of the bridge, there were almost no visitors on the single-plank bridge at this moment. One of the elders was a short old man dressed in coarse clothes. He looked much like a bandit, and he was the shortest but possessed the most impressive aura out of the 3 elders. He slapped another elder on the shoulder and said, "Old Suan, what are you standing there like a block of wood for? Hurry up and pay." The old man with the surname Sun was busy talking to the young woman and asking her what was unique about this place's scenery. After being slapped on the shoulder, he hurriedly retrieved 9 snowflake coins in an obsequious manner, accepting this loss without a single complaint. In fact, this old man who was paying for his companions was none other than Senior Sun, the person who had gifted Julien several steamy romance novels during their time together in Old Dragon City's dust medicinal shop. Julien deeply admired the exquisite knowledge of this senior. Afterward, Sui Yubian had left their group and gone to the sect where Senior Sun hailed from, the Parasol Leaf Continent's Jade Tablet sect. The Parasol Leaf sect had suffered severe damage following Du Mao's failure to ascend, and as a result, the Jade Tablet sect had already become the undisputed #1 sect in the Parasol Leaf Continent. The final elder was an ordinary-looking old man, and he wanted to say something yet couldn't help but hesitate. He wanted to persuade his bold and confident friend to hold back a little. Senior Sun had traveled to another continent to visit him out of the kindness of his heart, yet he had treated Senior Sun with such a poor attitude the entire time. What was the meaning of this? Did he truly think that Senior Sun was a junior disciple in his invincible Divine Fist sect? Moreover, if it weren't for Senior Sun's assistance, could they have obtained the largest shard of Du Mao's shattered colored glaze golden body so smoothly and easily? Taking 10,000 steps back, Sun Yuan was still a powerful immortal tier cultivator from the Parasol Leaf Continent. At the same time, he was also the elderly sect leader of the Jade Tablet sect. That being the case, where was this old man who had fallen back down to the nascent tier getting his courage from? How did he dare to order this senior around every single day? This final elder was none other than the upper 5-tier vagrant cultivator from Wasptail Ferry Station. At the same time, he was also Zhang Yun's master. In other words, this single-plank bridge was the fated opportunity that had allowed this old man to form his golden core back then. The 3rd-tier maidservant from the Immortal Force was naturally unable to recognize the profound cultivation bases of the 3 elders. To say nothing of her, even the Sea Observation tier mountain master wouldn't be able to see through their cultivation bases if he were present. One was at the Immortal tier, one was at the Unpolished Jade tier, and one was at the Nascent tier. Any one of them could probably shatter this mountain with a casual stomp of their foot. After Sun Yuan handed the young woman 9 snowflake coins, the 3 old friends slowly walked onto the single-plank bridge together. Sun Yuan was the oldest of the 3, and also possessed the highest cultivation base. However, this old man who had the nickname Footlong Spear in the Parasol Leaf Continent was truly unable to act tough in front of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's handsome chivalrous young man. One time they had both been observing the same event through their own enchanted picture scrolls. The handsome chivalrous young man had unexpectedly asked Footlong Spear whether he was able to fight, and if he could, whether he was able to travel over to render some minor assistance. Sun Yuan had patted his chest and promised that he was able to help. Even if he couldn't fight, he definitely wouldn't perform so badly as to detrimentally affect the situation. Afterward, the handsome chivalrous young man, the old sect leader who had named his force the Invincible Divine Fist sect even though he was a chi refiner, had given Footlong Spear Sun Yuan an address and told him to meet with him there. Sun Yuan had directly flown over at lightning-quick speed. As it turned out, the Taoist Heavenly Lord from the Divine Edict sect who had just advanced to the 12th tier, had gotten into a conflict with Wasptail Ferry Station's Unpolished Jade tier vagrant cultivator. Both parties had been hellbent on obtaining that shard of Du Mao's colored glaze golden body, causing them to enter a deadlock. If things had continued like that, then the Invincible Divine Fist sect and the Divine Edict sect would have at least developed animosity with each other regardless of the final outcome. However, Sun Yuan's arrival had immediately broken the deadlock. In the end, they had just barely reached a satisfactory outcome for everyone. The Unpolished Jade tier vagrant cultivator parted with almost all of his savings to purchase the large shard of colored glaze golden body that was a once-in-1,000-year treasure. Even so, it was abundantly clear that Heavenly Lord Qizhan, the #1 cultivator of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, at least on the surface, had made a huge concession. Apart from helping the Divine Edict sect receive payment from the Unpolished Jade tier vagrant cultivator, Sun Yuan had also helped them by making contact with one of the 72 Confucian saints who was responsible for overseeing the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, asking the Confucian saint for the shattered small world that the colored glaze golden body had fled into. Sun Yuan handed this ancient small world to Heavenly Lord Qizhan to repair and refine, and if the latter managed things well, he could transform the shattered small world into a blessed land in which the disciples of the Divine Edict sect could achieve double the cultivation results with half the effort. Generally speaking, cultivators at the upper 5 tiers wouldn't enter shattered small worlds for no good reason. However, nothing in the world was absolute. Indeed, among the Confucian sages in the majestic world, there was a certain group of sages who especially traveled around to expand the territories. These sages would look for ruins drifting at the bottom of the river of time, and after fishing them out, the sages would either stabilize them and transform them into new blessed lands or directly fuse them into the land of the majestic world. Many Confucian sages had died in the river of time because of this practice, and even more of them had ended up with damage to the foundation of their great Tao. However, even though they faced such perilous dangers and made such great sacrifices, this was something that the world was completely oblivious to. Upon first arriving at the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy to study, Li Huai had been severely bullied by his classmates and the other students. However, there was always brightness after gloom, and not only did the bullying eventually stop, but he even managed to make 2 new friends. They were the same age as him, and one was a talented student from a poor family, Lu Guan. The other was the descendant of a wealthy clan in the Great Sui Nation, Ma Lian. Lu Guan was extremely bold and courageous even though he was from a poor family, and he would always come up with peculiar and unrestrained thoughts. On the other hand, it was surprisingly Ma Lian who was timid and cowardly even though he came from the most well-off family of the 3 friends. He was always hesitant and nervous, and this caused him to become a little lackey of Lu Guan and Li Huai, always following them around and playing with them. Ma Lian was from a first-rate clan in the Great Sui Nation, one which was related through marriage to the Gao clan. Not only that, but Ma Lian was also a direct descendant and the eldest grandson. Thus, many students in the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy ostracized and ridiculed him now that he was hanging out with Li Huai and Lu Guan, calling him a pathetic lackey and a money bag. Summer arrived, and the 3 children who were in the same year, same class, and same dorm continued to sneak out of their dorm even when the academy started to enforce a night curfew. They went to the lakeside to cool down, and this was an act that would earn them a good scolding and the punishment of transcribing texts, standing in a corner, and rulers to the palm if they were caught by a teacher. Lu Guan led the way tonight, and he walked with a confident swagger as if he were a teacher on night patrol on the academy grounds. Li Huai looked around in a relatively cautious manner, while Ma Lian had a reluctant expression as he hung his head and carefully followed behind Li Huai. The 3 of them arrived at the lake without a hitch, and Lu Guan took off his boots and dipped his feet into the slightly cool lake water. However, he felt like something was still missing, so he turned to his relieved friend and said, "Ma Lian, it's so humid and hot in summer. And if I remember correctly, isn't your Ma clan regarded as having the best fan collection in the capital? When you return home, remember to grab 3 fans and give Li Huai and me 1 fan each. That way, we can cool ourselves down when we do homework after class." There was a pitiable expression on Ma Lian's face as he replied, "My grandpa cherishes those fans the most, and he treats each fan like a treasure close to his heart. He won't give them to me." Lu Guan rolled his eyes and said, "Then just steal a few fans that your grandpa doesn't look at often. Even if he finds out, will he truly beat you to death?" Li Huai smoothed things over and said, "Forget about it. Ma Lian is a scaredy cat, and his expression always gives him away. If he truly goes home to steal a few fans, it's extremely likely that his mom and dad will immediately notice something amiss." Ma Lian vigorously nodded in agreement. Lu Guan sighed and lamented, "What a waste of your good background. You can't do this and you don't dare to do that. If you ask me, Ma Lian, I'd say that you won't achieve much even when you grow older. At most, you'll simply continue to live off your clan's wealth. After all, your grandpa is the Ministry of Revenue's head minister and the great scholar of the Lingying Hall, while your father is only a prefectural overseer in the regions and your uncle is only a measly seal overseeing official even though he's still in the capital. Following this pattern, you'll probably be nothing more than a county magistrate when it's your turn to become an official." Ma Lian sighed again and again, not retorting his friend as he spoke. He didn't have the courage to argue with Lu Guan, and he didn't think that Lu Guan was wrong in the first place. Of the 3 of them, Lu Guan was scolded the most by the teachers, But even a blind idiot could tell that the teachers actually had the highest hopes and expectations for Lu Guan. They were neutral toward Ma Lian, and his results were slightly better than that of Li Huai, who was always at the bottom of the cohort. Li Huai patted Ma Lian's shoulder and consoled. Becoming a county magistrate is already very impressive. Over at my hometown, the highest-ranking official used to be a kiln supervision official, and it was only recently that we finally got a county magistrate. In any case, you'll still be our friend regardless of how high-ranking or low-ranking your official position is. If you become a low-ranking official, Lu Guan and I will definitely still be your friend. If you become a high-ranking official, however, make sure not to forget about us, okay? I definitely won't forget you guys, Ma Lian hurriedly promised. I'll always treat the two of you as my best friends. Lu Guan chuckled and asked, between me and Li Huai, who would you say your best friend is? Ma Lian was dumbfounded, and he felt like his answer would be wrong no matter what he said. Even though he admired Lu Guan's talent and smarts as well as his maturity and resoluteness, deep down in his heart, he still enjoyed hanging out with Li Huai more. Li Huai was more easygoing and less incisive, and he wouldn't pick on him and make him feel ashamed and inferior all the time. Li Huai smiled and placed his feet in the water, causing him to immediately shiver and draw a sharp. He laughed and said, I'll take second place and give first place to Lu Guan. I won't compete with him, especially since he comes first in everything anyway. Lu Guan wrapped his arm around Li Huai's shoulders and chuckled. You're speaking as if you're purposely conceding first place to me. Can you beat me anyway? Li Huai hurriedly begged for mercy, replying, No, I can't beat you. Anyway, why are you trying to compete with someone whose results are always at the bottom of the cohort, Lu Guan? Don't you find this embarrassing? Ma Lian smiled in secret. At the end of the day, this was a peaceful and carefree period of the three children's lives. The angry bellow of a teacher suddenly traveled over from the distance. Lu Guan pushed Li Huai and Ma Lian's shoulders, saying, You guys run first, I'll hold the bulbous-nosed Mr. Han back. Ma Lian immediately sprinted for his life without uttering a single word. In fact, he was running away barefoot. Li Huai picked Ma Lian's boots up and asked, Then what about you? Lu Guan shot a glare at him and exclaimed, Hurry up and run, or else our punishment will be even more severe if we're all caught together. We'll be absolutely screwed tomorrow. Li Huai hurriedly put on his boots and ran away in a steadier manner than Ma Lian. He had walked all the way from the Great Li Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture to the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy, after all. In the end, Lu Guan stayed back by himself to face the wrath of Mr. Han, who was on night patrol duty today. If it weren't for Lu Guan correctly answering all of Mr. Han's questions regarding his studies, the old teacher could have punished him to standing beside the lake for the entire night. Li Huai opened the door for Lu Guan when his friend returned to the dorm and he asked, How was it? Lu Guan raised his right hand and snapped his fingers, replying with a smug expression, There's nothing in the world that I, Lu Guan, can't deal with. Li Huai was extremely perceptive and he asked, Aren't you left-handed? Lu Guan immediately cursed and sat down beside the table, spreading open his left hand, which was already red and swollen. There was anger on his face as he replied. Old drunkard Han was definitely suppressing his anger about something. Either the wine in the capital went up in price, or his two unworthy grandchildren went and caused trouble again. He used me to vent his anger, and he swung his ruler especially hard tonight. Even so, Lu Guan was a simple person and he was someone who could fall asleep straight away. While Li Huai and Ma Lian were tossing and turning and feeling anxious about tomorrow's potential punishment, Lu Guan had already closed his eyes and fallen fast asleep. Lu Guan slept on the outside of the straw mat, while Li Huai slept on the inside next to the wall and Ma Lian slept in the middle. Li Huai wasn't feeling sleepy, so he sat against the wall and borrowed the moonlight to play with his painted wooden doll, mumbling something as he did so. Li Huai, why haven't you played with Li Baoping recently? Ma Lian asked in a quiet voice. I've been scared of her ever since I was little, Li Huai replied in a casual voice. In any case, how can I play with a girl all the time? What if people mistakenly think that I like her? If rumors start to spread, Li Baoping will definitely beat me half dead. Oh, I see, Ma Lian replied with a slightly disappointed expression. He felt like the young girl wearing the bright red jacket was truly very pretty. He would feel happy for an entire day even if he only managed to catch a glimpse of her from far away. Ma Yan fell silent for a long time, and Li Huai continued to swing his painted wooden doll around under the radiance of the moon. He was having heaps of fun pretending to be a general on the battlefield. Ma Yan knew that Li Huai's small bamboo bookcase held a large collection of his favorite belongings. Li Huai, you always talk about that Chen Ping'an. So why hasn't he ever come to the academy to visit you after almost 3 years? Ma Yan suddenly asked. Li Huai stopped swinging his doll around and zoned out for a long time. In the end he smiled and replied, because he's busy. Ma Yan was surprised to discover Li Huai lying on the straw mat soon after their short exchange, with his painted wooden doll placed beside his head. Generally speaking, Li Huai would play with his doll for almost an entire hour before going to sleep. However, tonight was clearly an exception. In reality, Li Huai was staring at the moonlight outside the window with his eyes wide open. A green bamboo bookcase, a pair of straw sandals, and a black jade hairpin with the characters Huaiyin. These were the 3 items that Li Huai cherished the most. Li Baoping and Lin Shui also had a jade hairpin each, with Chen Ping'an giving the jade hairpins to the 3 of them at the same time back then. However, Li Huai felt like his jade hairpin was the best of the 3. He also had a book titled Severed Watercliff, and Chen Ping'an was the one who had purchased this book for him back in Red Candle Town. There was also the painted wooden doll that Li Huai often played with and showed off to others, and he had obtained this doll along with his yellow ebony box from Go Table Mountain's Mountain Lord Weibo when sharing the spoils with his companions at that time. This painted wooden doll was Li Huai's #1 general. Li Huai had wanted to gift this doll to Chen Ping'an back then, but Chen Ping'an had turned down his offer and told him to take care of it instead. And thus, Li Huai had placed the doll between the pages of the Severed Watercliff. He also owned a set of lifelike clay statues, and these were a gift from the Wind Snow Temple's Wei Jin. The 5 clay statues weren't as tall and mighty as the painted wooden doll, measuring no more than half a finger tall each. There was a wandering swordsman, a Taoist priest holding a horsetail whisk, an armored warrior, a crane-riding woman and a gong-beating watchman. Li Huai had given each of these so-called generals a nickname and an official title. The flying sword immortal Wei Jin had also told Li Huai something else back then, but the young boy had already forgotten his words completely. It was something about the profound puppet knowledge of naturalists and mahists and the vast talisman knowledge of Taoists or whatever. And there was also something about 7th tier or 8th tier qi refiners and whatnot. Li Huai had been engrossed in happiness back then, so how could he have remembered the random ramblings of sword immortal Wei Jin? Afterward, when introducing the 5 clay statues to his 2 friends, he couldn't find a way to brag about their value no matter how he racked his brains. It was only after that moment that he had somewhat recalled the words of sword immortal Wei Jin. Even so, Li Huai didn't ask Li Baoping or Lin Shui about this, 2 of his companions who had very good memories. Since Chen Ping'an had promised that he would come to the academy to visit them, Li Huai decided to ask Chen Ping'an about this when he visited. After all, Chen Ping'an could remember everything. There was also a piece of paper with the character Qi written on it, something that Mr. Qi had given to them and asked them to carefully study and copy. However, Chen Ping'an had seemingly forgotten about them already. In the beginning, he had still sent letters and picture scrolls to Li Baoping. Afterward, however, he didn't even send a single letter to the young girl. Compared to the trivial behavior of Li Huai and his 2 friends, Lin Shui was already widely regarded as a prodigy in Mountain Cliff Academy. He juggled both his studies and cultivation without detrimentally affecting either, and many teachers in the academy had very high hopes and expectations for him. Starting from very early on, he had frequently traveled outside and journeyed around the Great Sui Nation with an old immortal who was exceptionally skilled at lightning techniques. In fact, he had spent almost half of his time outside the academy. The last person to enjoy such special treatment was the youngest virtuous scholar, who studied at the Great Sui Nation's Lakeview Academy. Moreover, that virtuous scholar also had the potential to become a noble scholar according to the assistant mountain master of Lakeview Academy. As he grew older, Lin Shui transformed from a handsome young boy into a carefree and refined young master. Following this, more and more girls both inside and outside the academy started to respect and admire him. Many young women from first-rate clans in the capital of the Great Sui Nation would especially travel to the academy located on East Mountain just to catch a glimpse of Lin Shui from far away. Lin Shui gradually developed an ethereal aura that made him appear increasingly distant from the mortal world. He became more and more famous, and he appeared like a flawless piece of white jade in the eyes of others. Because of this, Lin Shui's name was mentioned more and more by the many officials and influential individuals in the capital of the empire. His name was mentioned in casual conversations between officials, in conversations between elders and juniors in large clans, and in many other places. Everyone started to observe and pay attention to this young scholar to varying degrees. There were many sets of eyes on him, and there were also numerous trivial matters for him to deal with daily. As an illegitimate son of a petty official from Dragon Spring Prefecture, Lin Shui neither felt conceited and satisfied nor annoyed and troubled. Cultivating the mind was also one aspect of cultivation. The harder one was willing to work to temper one's mind, the fewer imperfections one would have when advancing tiers in the future. Due to his many journeys around the nation, Lin Shui had seen and heard a lot regarding the winds of change sweeping through the imperial court of the Great Sui nation. Once the most prosperous and flourishing nation in the northern region of the continent, the Great Sui nation was now gripped by an atmosphere of grief and sorrow. However, Lin Shui wasn't interested in any of these things. In fact, he wasn't even interested in the heavy cavalry of his home nation, the Great Li Empire, marching south and smashing through enemy nations like a sword-splitting bamboo. Apart from the lightning techniques taught to him by that old teacher from the academy, Lin Shui also spent a lot of time and effort to diligently study the recite atop cloud scripture which he had obtained from Go Table Mountain. Not long ago, Lin Shui had traveled to the northern mountain of the Great Sui nation, and an immortal abode called Divine Cloud Mountain with the old teacher. Their journey had taken 3 months, and Lin Shui had traveled on an immortal boat for the first time in his life. This was in order to observe a thundercloud from close up. The view had been magnificent and soul-stirring, and the old teacher had left the swaying immortal boat and soared through the sky, displaying his mystical abilities that allowed him to catch lightning with his bare hands. He placed the crackling arcs of lightning into an immortal bottle, a thunderbelly bottle, that was especially used to hold lightning, and he gave it to Lin Shui as a present, telling the young man that he could use it to absorb spiritual energy when he returned to the academy to cultivate. Today, Lin Shui walked under the night sky by himself, heading to the scripture library to study some texts. The teachers on night patrol duty naturally wouldn't stop him. The Confucian Academy had many rules, but it wasn't pedantic and stubborn about upholding them regardless of the situation. Lin Shui entered the scripture library and lit a lamp, reading all the way until the following morning. After becoming a qi refiner, Lin Shui could read for an entire night without becoming tired as long as he nurtured his mind and qi properly. Lin Shui put a book away and walked to the window. This was exactly the moment when the murky qi of heaven and earth was sinking and the fresh qi was rising. The world seen by qi refiners was completely different from the world seen by mortal humans. The naked eyes of mortal humans couldn't see the circulation of spiritual energy, the rising of murderous aura, the gathering of yang energy, or the dispersion of yin energy. With the front gates to their internal cave abodes tightly shut, mortal humans were unable to absorb spiritual energy and temper their bodies, thereby being unable to extend their lifespan. At the same time, however, this also meant that mortal humans wouldn't be affected by the numerous types of chaotic astral wind blustering through the world. Their birth, old age, illnesses, and deaths would all be decided by the heavens. Cui Dongshan had once composed a poem. It was a poem that made Lin Shui feel a strong sense of yearning. Winds howling and waves roaring, I ride atop the moon palace and freely travel 10,000 li soaring through magnificent immortal abodes, gazing down at the misty lands below. Drunk, I shake the osmanthus tree on the moon, giving rise to a cool breeze in the mortal world. 1. After entering Mountain Cliff Academy and flipping through those yellowing ancient texts, Lin Shui discovered many legends about ancient immortals genuinely being able to travel to the Sun Palace and Moon Palace, where they would then enjoy immortal wine with the gods and become drunk for hundreds upon thousands of years. Lin Shui was filled with yearning for such an experience. However, he suddenly heaved a soft sigh. If such a day truly came, then he wished that a certain beautiful young woman would be accompanying him as well. A smile involuntarily stretched across Lin Shui's face when he thought of her. If the young women in the capital of the Great Sui nation saw this, it was very likely that their hearts would flutter in adoration. During these past few years, Lin Shui would occasionally recall the long journey that he had embarked on during his youth. He was slightly befuddled at the time, and they had faced more surprises than actual dangers on the way. Everything had been new and exciting to him, and it was the first time that he had come across ghosts and spirits in the mountains and rivers, the first time he had seen a mountain lord, the first time he had obtained a fated opportunity pertaining to cultivation, the first time he had stayed in an immortal and brimming with immortal chi, the first time he had seen painted door gods that were as tall as people, the first time he had received a small bookcase and a jade hairpin as gifts, and the first time he had banded together with his travel companions in the unfamiliar academy of the Great Sui Nation to overcome challenges and adversaries together. Lin Shui suddenly felt a slight sense of disappointment. It was as if everyone had scattered and grown distant following the departure of that person. Even though they were studying in the same academy and would often meet up, it was without a doubt that they had already drifted apart. It was as if a clear spring were splitting apart and going in several different directions, with each body of water growing larger and more powerful. There were cheerful streams like Li Huai, there were vast and mighty rivers like him, and there were calm and voluntarily unmoving lakes like Li Baoping. Of course, there were also deep wells and underground rivers like Yulu and Xie. Looking back, however, all of them had been boisterous while stumbling over a myriad of obstacles back then. They had all been knee-deep in mud, and they had all been wearing straw sandals and carrying bamboo bookcases while camping in the wilderness and guarding the night for each other. Lin Shui heaved a soft sigh. There was no going back. In the beginning, Yu Lu had enjoyed an entire dorm to himself. Afterward, Prince Gao Xian moved in as his roommate, after which the two of them developed a close relationship and never left each other's side. Yet, not long ago, Yu Lu had ended up becoming a lonesome person again. This was because Gao Xian had secretly left Mountain Cliff Academy and gone to Forest Deer Academy located in the Dragon Spring Prefecture's Cloud Drape Mountain. Gao Xian explained that he was going there to seek knowledge. Yet those with a discerning eye could easily see through his lie and understand the truth. Prince Gao Xian was nothing more than a royal hostage of the Great Li Empire. After the Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan and the Great Sui Nation's Imperial Gao clan signed those treaties and became allies with each other, it wasn't just Gao Xian who had traveled to the Great Li Empire as a hostage. In addition to him, an 11th-tier gatekeeper of the Great Sui Nation's capital, and the initially retired Old Flood Dragon of the Yellow Court Nation, had also traveled to the Great Li Empire to become assistant mountain masters of the newly constructed Forest Deer Academy. Yu Lu had accompanied Gao Xian to the foot of the mountain before stopping, and not seeing him off any further. Today morning, Yu Lu had unexpectedly knocked on the courtyard door of a standalone residence. The person who answered the door was Xie. Xie. Yu Lu saw her open the door with a broom in her hand. Even though Cui Dongshan had already left the academy for a long time, it appeared as if Xie was still working diligently as a maidservant every single day. "Why are you here?" Xie asked with a stern expression. "Okay, you've already seen me now, so what next?" Xie asked. "I'm not asking too much to go inside to enjoy a cup of tea, am I?" Yu Lu replied in a helpless voice. Xie hesitated for a moment before eventually deciding to let Yu Lu, the young man whom she should have respectfully referred to as Crown Prince, step inside her courtyard. Her courtyard wasn't large, and it was absolutely spotless thanks to her diligent sweeping every single day. When autumn came and the leaves started to fall, or when it was spring and catkins flew around, it would most likely be harder work for her to clean the courtyard. Xie pointed at the main building in the courtyard, where the doors were tightly shut and the corridor under the eaves was paved with green bamboo planks. It was as if the walkway were a large straw mat, and Yu Lu could easily imagine the young boy with a birthmark on his glabella lazily lying there on his side during a cool night and gazing up at the starry constellations. "Remember to take off your shoes before walking up the stairs," Xie reminded the young man. "Otherwise, I'll need to scrub it clean again after you leave." Yu Lu removed his boots and sat down on the bamboo walkway. This bamboo was most likely grown by some agrarian cultivator in an immortal force, and it would already be very extravagant for an ordinary noble in the Great Sui Nation to craft a brush holder from this material. Indeed, such a brush holder would make a very refined gift between literati. If one owned a sleeping mat or a bamboo chair crafted from this bamboo, that would be an even more impressive display of one's network and wealth. In this courtyard, however, none of these things would be worth a mention. Xie continued to bustle around and clean, not brewing or pouring any tea for Yulu. It was early in the morning after all, so who in the world would drink tea? Did he genuinely think that he was still the crown prince of the Lu Empire? Yulu was inferior to even Gao Xian at this moment, seeing that the Guiyang Gao clan had at least kept the Great Sui nation intact. On the other hand, the survivors from the Lu clan were dragged to the large mountains in the western region of the Dragon Spring Prefecture and forced to work as slaves and coolies. They were punished by the scorching and the lashing rain all year round, and they would either suffer lashings or be reduced to nothing more than mere commodities for trade. They were purchased by various immortal forces who were constructing residences in the mountains, becoming slaves and maidservants to serve their masters. The fate of the Lu Empire and the Great Sui nation couldn't be any more different. Yulu leaned back and lay down on the bamboo walkway, asking, Xie, have you ever thought about the future that you desire? Xie sat down beside the stone table and replied, No. Dressed in the Confucian robes of the academy, Yulu placed his hands on his abdomen and revealed, Your young master gave me a good beating before leaving the academy. What's wrong? You can't defeat Cui Dongshan, so you came here to use me to vent your anger? Xie asked with a sneer. As expected of a 7th-tier martial artist who possesses half the martial fortune of an empire. However, are you sure you can defeat me? After being captured by the Great Li Empire, that imperial concubine in the palace had instructed a sword cultivator, a guest elder of the empire, to drive several dragon-restricting nails into her critical acupoints. The imperial concubine had been extraordinarily vicious and sinister. Afterward, Cui Dongshan had removed half of the dragon-restricting nails and allowed her to partially recover her cultivation base, becoming an abode tier qi refiner. Before leaving the academy, Cui Dongshan had removed several more dragon-restricting nails, leaving only one in her body. However, this dragon-restricting nail was driven into an acupoint that held one of her bonded items. Even so, she had finally regained her cultivation base as a C observation tier qi refiner. In addition to this, Cui Dongshan had also set up numerous secret formations in the small courtyard. At the same time, he also taught Xie how to activate, channel, and deactivate the large majority of these formations. Because of this, staying in the small courtyard granted Xie a similar ability to Mao Xiaodong staying in Mountain Cliff Academy. Yulu sat up and replied with a faint smile, You'll still lose if we truly fight with each other. Oh, is that so? Then you're truly amazing, aren't you? Xie replied with an apathetic expression. I must have misjudged your strength, so do you need me to bow and apologize? Yulu lay back down on the bamboo walkway, using his hands as a pillow as he sighed with emotion. Even though they were both evil remnants of the Lu Empire, meaning that they should have shared the same pain and looked out for each other, Xie felt a deep sense of loathing toward Yulu's acceptance of the circumstances. Moreover, she didn't conceal her emotions at all. Yulu closed his eyes and said, Lying here is quite comfortable, so allow me to take a quick nap. Xie hesitated for a moment and decided against shooing him away. In reality, she was a little curious about why Yulu hadn't gone to Forest Deer Academy with Gao Xian. If Yulu went to the Great Li Empire, he could at least look after the struggling survivors of the Lu clan. Moreover, there was actually a decent number of generals from the destroyed Lu Empire who had surrendered to the Great Li Empire and were relatively valued and trusted. Many of them were marching south with the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire, and it was said that they had made exceptional contributions and were starting to integrate well with the Empire's army. Even if one were to disregard all of this, Yulu had already become a citizen of the Great Li Empire. At the same time, he was also a young Vajrabadi tier martial artist. This was quite terrifying. Ignoring everything else about the Emperor of the Great Li Empire, there was one thing that Xie had to concede. He was genuinely magnanimous and tolerant. The same could be said about Song Chongjing. In any case, everything pointed to the fact that Yulu should have gone to Forest Deer Academy. However, Yulu insisted on staying at Mountain Cliff Academy for some reason. In the eyes of the Great Sui nation's imperial court and the upper echelon of the academy, Lin Shui was the most outstanding cultivation talent among the group of outsiders who had entered the academy back then, and he would reach the greatest cultivation heights in the future. Meanwhile, Li Baoping, the young girl wearing the bright red jacket, was the most interesting of the group, and no one could bring themselves to dislike her. Xie had the most powerful backer, while Li Huai was the most dangerous to provoke even though his talent in scholarly studies was the most mediocre. As for Yu Lu, he always kept a low profile and drew little attention to himself, making it very easy for others to forget about his existence. Even after Yu Lu became friends with Prince Gao Xian, people were still of the opinion that he wasn't worth their attention. In fact, people's opinion of him became even lower. After all, he was nothing more than an opportunistic young man who liked to ingratiate himself with descendants of the imperial family. Yu Lu suddenly opened his eyes and said, "Your young master said that Chan Ping'an is already on the verge of advancing to the 5th tier of martial arts. However, his true combat power is even higher than this. What's wrong? Are you afraid of being overtaken?" Xie asked, taking great pleasure in Yu Lu's apparent misfortune. Yu Lu shook his head and replied, "He'll definitely catch up to me. Very soon." Xie asked with a frown. "Much sooner than you anticipate," Yu Lu replied with a nod. "Is he favored by martial fortune?" Xie asked. Yu Lu shook his head and responded, "No, but it's exactly because he isn't favored by martial fortune that his progress makes me feel a little melancholy." Xie had no response to this. What would Chan Ping'an be like the next time they met each other? Xie couldn't imagine this. Perhaps he would still be carrying a bamboo bookcase and wearing straw sandals? Perhaps he would merely be a little taller than before? Li Baoping was also living in a dorm by herself. This was the only matter that Mao Xiaodong and Cui Dongshan, two mortal enemies, could find common ground on. Each dorm was designed for 4 students, so theoretically speaking, Li Baoping's room should have been very empty seeing that she was living by herself. In reality, however, this was far from the case. With the exception of her bed, the remaining 3 beds were all filled with piles of neatly stacked paper. Regarding this situation, the teachers at the academy were forced to complain to the mountain master. The young girl had already transcribed enough text for her to be punished 100 times over, so how in the world could they still punish her? The teachers on night patrol duty were extremely amused by the situation as well. Whenever they went on night patrol, it was almost guaranteed that they would see the little girl burning the midnight oil to transcribe texts. Her calligraphy brush would fly over the paper, and it seemed like she was working a little too diligently. In the beginning, some elderly teachers had spoken up for Li Baoping, mistakenly thinking that it was the young girl's teachers who were targeting her and punishing her to transcribe so many texts. This was far too strict on her, so the elderly teachers had complained about this in secret. When the truth was revealed to them in the end, they didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Li Baoping's teachers explained that the young girl enjoyed transcribing texts, but in reality, there was absolutely no need for her to transcribe such a large amount of sagely texts. Li Baoping would occasionally wag class to zone out atop East Mountain, or she would sneak out of the academy to wander around the streets of the capital, and this would indeed result in her receiving punishment from the academy and needing to transcribe texts. Even so, there was simply no way she would be punished to transcribing so many texts. The problem was, Li Baoping enjoyed transcribing texts, so how could her teachers stop her? The teachers would need to threaten other students with physical punishment to force them to transcribe texts, especially the students who were lively and mischievous. Li Baoping was the complete opposite, and she had already built up a small mountain of transcriptions in her room. Fortunately, occasionally wagging class was the only bad behavior that Li Baoping engaged in. All of the teachers in the academy knew who she was, and apart from her truancy, almost everything else about her was extremely likable. Of course, this was apart from the strange and mysterious questions that she often liked to ask. These questions would also cause headaches for the teachers, and they truly didn't understand how the young girl could hold so many incomprehensible thoughts in her head. For example, why did all of the rivers in the world like to wind left and right? Could the teachers answer this question? When it rained, would the mosquitoes outside the dorms be smashed to death by the raindrops? Did the teachers know anything about this? In any case, Li Baoping had looked around for a long time after the rain cleared up, yet she hadn't found a single mosquito corpse on the ground. Why was that? And why didn't the fish in the lake die after drinking so much water? The teachers also couldn't answer this question, right? That being the case, were any of these questions answered in the books? If they were, then Li Baoping could flick through these books herself. This gave Li Baoping's teachers a slight headache. However, when they chatted and joked with each other, They mused whether they could compile a book with all of Li Baoping's quirky questions. On this day, Li Huai coincidentally didn't play with his two friends, Lu Guan and Ma Lian. He said that he needed to go to the toilet, yet he actually went to the peak of East Mountain by himself. Sure enough, he saw Li Baoping dressed in a long red skirt and sitting on a branch. Li Huai didn't dare to greet her, so he rested his arms and head on the stone table atop the mountain and gazed at her from a distance. She frequently came here and climbed on top of the tree. After zoning out for a while, Li Baoping deftly wrapped her arms around the tree trunk and slid down, after which she sprinted off down the mountain. She saw Li Huai sitting in the distance, with his arm raised in the air yet not knowing what to say. Li Baoping only shot a quick glance at him before turning around and continuing on her merry way, sprinting down the mountain like a gust of wind. Li Huai felt slightly upset and aggrieved, so he found himself a branch and started to scribble on the ground. His eyes suddenly lit up. He remembered that he had scribbled Mom and Dad last time, and they had indeed arrived at the academy soon after to visit him. That being the case, what if he wrote Chen Ping'an's name? Would this work as well? Li Huai grinned and started to write Chen Ping'an with his branch. Yet, before he could finish, a hand suddenly reached over and wiped away the name that was only one stroke away from being completed. Li Huai was extremely confused, and he turned around only to see Li Baoping, who had returned at some unknown time. Li Huai stubbornly began to write the character Qian on the ground again. However, Li Baoping reached over and wiped it away. If this were in the past, Li Huai might have shrunk back after being challenged twice in a row by Li Baoping. Today was different, and it was as if he had suddenly found the courage to disobey the young girl. He overcame his fear and started to write on the ground again. Li Baoping didn't say anything, and she continued to wipe the characters away again and again. In the end, Li Huai persisted until his branch snapped, yet he still failed to write a complete Chen on the ground. This was not to mention the characters Ping and An. Li Huai tossed the broken branch away and burst into tears. Still squatting down, Li Baoping ignored Li Huai and picked up the broken branch. Her chin was slightly sharp already, and she rested it on one arm as she started to write Junior Uncle on the ground. She was quite happy with her handiwork, and she nodded in satisfaction. Li Huai roughly wiped the tears from his face and sobbed. Li Baoping, when Chen Ping'an comes, I'm going to complain to him if you continue to bully me. If he becomes angry, he might refuse to be your junior uncle in the future. Li Baoping changed scripts and continued to write Junior Uncle with the broken branch. She was completely focused as she stared at the ground, and she treated Li Huai's threats as nothing more than empty air. Li Huai suddenly squeezed out a smile and asked in a careful voice, Li Baoping, can you let me write 3 characters? They're extremely effective, and Chen Ping'an might arrive at the academy tomorrow. Really, I'm not lying to you. I missed my mom and dad back then, and after I wrote Mom and Dad on the ground, they immediately visited the academy with my older sister. You also know about this, right? Li Baoping didn't so much as glance up as she handed the broken branch to Li Huai. Li Huai was overjoyed, yet he had only just completed the first stroke when Li Baoping suddenly frowned and warned, "Write properly." Li Huai's hand shook in fright, causing the next stroke to immediately become crooked. "What are you doing?" he sobbed with downturned lips. Li Baoping helped him wipe the crooked stroke away. Li Huai's sobs turned into a smile, and he started to carefully write the character Chen. When he finished writing Chen Ping'an's name, Li Baoping looked around and asked, "Where is he?" There was a sullen expression on Li Huai's face as he replied, "How can it be so quick?" Li Baoping stood up and nimbly ran back to the tall tree, climbing onto a branch and gazing into the distance. Li Huai's eyes darted around, and knowing that things were going south, he immediately tossed the branch aside and started to flee. However, could he possibly outrun Li Baoping? She caught up to him in no time, causing him to squat down in terror and wrap his arms around his head. Surprisingly, however, Li Baoping didn't beat him up this time. Instead, she continued to run down the mountain, all the way until she reached the entrance of the academy. She then left to wander around the streets and alleys of the capital. While Li Baoping was busily roaming the capital of the Great Sui Nation, Li Huai breathed a sigh of relief and walked back to his dorm. Over at the entrance of the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy, a group of 4 travel-worn people made their way over, with a young man dressed in white and carrying a bamboo bookcase and sword on his back, smiling and handing his travel documents over to an elderly Confucian scholar. The old Confucian scholar examined the documents for a long time, shifting his gaze over the myriad of stamps from the various countries and regions of the two continents. The old scholar was astonished, and he looked up and remarked with a smile, "Young Master Chan, you've traveled to so many places already." The young visitor to the academy smiled faintly and nodded in response. The old scholar handed the travel documents back to the young man called Chan Ping'an. The old scholar from the academy had a very good impression of the young man. He took another glance at Chan Ping'an, and he indeed liked the look of the bamboo bookcase and the long sword on Chan Ping'an's back. Traveling tens of thousands of kilometers to seek knowledge while carrying books and wielding a sword was something that all scholars should do. Indeed, this was something that scholars did best. "Excuse me, do you know a young girl called Li Baoping?" Chan Ping'an asked. "She likes to wear a bright red jacket or a long red skirt." The old scholar laughed heartily and replied, "Everyone in the academy knows this young girl. To say nothing of the academy, the young girl has most likely explored the entire capital of the great Sui nation as well. She's filled with energy and spirit every day, and old bones like us who can barely walk anymore are all extremely envious of her. In fact, she skipped class and snuck out of the academy again today. You might have run across little Baoping if you had come here 1 hour earlier." "She left the academy by herself?" Chan Ping'an asked. "That's the case every single time," the old scholar replied with a nod. Seeing Chan Ping'an's worried expression, the old scholar smiled and reassured, "Please don't worry, little Baoping has never encountered any trouble after sneaking into the capital so many times. In any case, the capital of the Great Sui nation has always been a peaceful place, and the residents of the capital have always been honest people. Moreover, the Ministry of Rights head minister is also the mountain master of the academy, so he frequently visits East Mountain to drink tea and chat with the other deputy mountain masters. Little Baoping won't run into any issues." "Are you visiting Mountain Cliff Academy to look for little Baoping?" the old scholar asked. "Looking at your passport, you're also from the Greatly Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture. Perhaps you're not only from the same place as little Baoping, but you're also her relative." Chan Ping'an smiled and replied, "No, we're not relatives, but we are indeed from the same place. I came to the capital of the Great Sui nation with little Baoping and the others a few years ago, but I didn't climb the mountain and enter the academy with them at that time." The old scholar couldn't help but find this a little strange. Back when these children from the Dragon Spring Prefecture had first entered Mountain Cliff Academy, the imperial court had first deployed elite cavalry to the border to welcome and receive them. Afterward, the emperor had personally visited the academy and hosted a grand welcoming ceremony. Not only that, but the emperor had also been extremely pleased and bestowed treasures to each of the children. That being the case, the old scholar should have theoretically caught 1 or 2 glances of Chan Ping'an even if he didn't enter the academy. "Do you want to wait here until Li Baoping returns?" the old scholar asked. Chan Ping'an nodded in response. After arriving at Mountain Cliff Academy, the first person whom he wanted to see was naturally little Baoping. Chan Ping'an would naturally visit Li Huai, Lin Shuyi, Yu Lu, and Xie Xie as well, especially Li Huai, the youngest of the group. However, none of them could compare to the young girl who wore a bright red jacket in autumn, winter, and spring, and only wore a long red skirt in summer. Chan Ping'an never denied his favoritism, and it was the undeniable truth that he had the closest relationship with little Baoping. This had been the case when journeying to the Great Sui nation, and this had also been the case when sending letters to little Baoping after traveling to Stalactite Mountain by himself. He had asked the young girl to help him, her junior uncle, share the letters with the others. After having his portrait painted atop Osmanthus Island, Chan Ping'an had again only sent a painting to little Baoping. Li Huai and the others hadn't received anything. Lin Shuyi, Yu Lu, and Xie Xie were definitely well aware of this favoritism. It was just that they didn't necessarily mind this difference in treatment. Lin Shuyi was a cultivation prodigy, while Yu Lu and Xie Xie were once important members of the Lu Empire. As for Li Huai, who only dared to act aggressively at home, he most likely believed that Chan Ping'an and Aoyang both had the closest relationship with him. This was the case in the past, and this was most likely still the case right now. The old scholar smiled and waved his hand, saying, "I suggest you and your companions enter the academy to put down your belongings first." Chen Ping'an thought about this for a moment before turning around to look at Pei Qian and the others. If he were by himself, he wouldn't mind standing at the entrance of the academy to wait for Li Baoping. He turned around and glanced at the end of the street. Meanwhile, Zhu Lian was observing the buildings of the academy that were constructed in the mountain. Even though they were new constructions by the Great Sui Nation's Ministry of Works, they were built with care and radiated with a simple yet elegant aura. Before being relocated from the Great Li Empire to the capital of the Great Sui Nation, Mountain Cliff Academy had previously been one of the 72 Confucian academies in the majestic world. This was Zhu Lian's first time visiting a Confucian academy after leaving the lotus flower-blessed land. The sound of scholars loudly reciting scriptures could be heard in places where Confucian sages taught. These locations would also be renowned throughout the world. During the foundational years of the Great Li Empire's Mountain Cliff Academy, the first mountain master had expounded certain principles that outlined the focus of the academy. He advocated for scholars to not only study, ask questions, contemplate, and discern, but to put the principles and theories into action as well. While Zhu Lian was gazing up and observing the academy, Shi Ro was standing beside him in apprehension, not even daring to breathe too loudly. Even though Shi Ro was living in an immortal body, allowing her to resist the intangible aura of righteousness, her instinct as a Yin entity still caused her to feel an innate sense of terror. Pei Qian remained silent the entire time, and it was as if she were even more tense and nervous than Shi Ro. When disembarking the ship at Old Dragon City, Pei Qian had announced in her mind that she would definitely meet Li Baoping one day. After arriving at the city gate leading to the capital of the Great Sui Nation, however, she had immediately started to feel anxious. She started to feel even more apprehensive after arriving at the front gate of Mountain Cliff Academy. Chen Ping'an smiled and asked, "If I may ask, after we enter the academy and settle down in the guest rooms, what should we do if we want to visit Mountain Master Mao? Do we need to inform someone first and have them notify the Mountain Master? And do we then need to wait for the Mountain Master's response?" The old scholar smiled and replied, "There's not much point in notifying the Mountain Master, as the main sticking point is that Mountain Master Mao isn't especially fond of hosting guests. Over the past few years, Mountain Master Mao has turned down almost all requests and invitations, and even the head minister of the nation might not be able to gain an audience with him. However, young Master Chen has traveled here from far away, and you're also someone who hails from the Great Li Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture. With this in mind, a quick heads up to the Mountain Master should suffice. Even though Mountain Master Mao is extremely rigorous when it comes to academic pursuits, he's actually a very amiable and easygoing person. It's because the renowned scholars in the Great Sui Nation are historically fond of mystical studies that Mountain Master Mao isn't fond of speaking with them." Chen Ping'an still didn't enter the academy, and he asked, "If I remember correctly, the infantry commander's office is the one responsible for the safety of the capital?" The old scholar immediately understood the situation. By the looks of it, this young man was still worried about Li Baoping's safety. He smiled and replied, "That's correct. Moreover, the young child of the commander is also studying at Mountain Cliff Academy right now." Chen Ping'an breathed a sigh of relief. Afterward, he asked some trivial questions about Li Baoping's current situation. Only after doing this did he bid farewell to the old scholar and enter the academy. Pei Qian's footsteps were heavy, and this was especially the case after she entered Mountain Cliff Academy. They were walking along a slightly inclined mountain path, yet it was as if she were wading through a river or pushing through snow. The academy had guest rooms for visiting parents of the students, and Li Huai's parents and older sister had stayed in one such room when visiting him back then. The academy only took payment in a symbolic manner, reflected by the fact that each room only cost a measly 10 copper coins per day. After learning that there were many vacant guest rooms in the academy right now, Chen Ping'an immediately asked the old scholar for 4 neighboring rooms. After putting down their luggage, Pei Qian immediately ran over to Chen Ping'an's room to transcribe texts. Chen Ping'an took off his bamboo bookcase and even untied his sword-nurturing gourd, and removed the pseudo-celestial tool, Sword Immortal, from his back. Zhu Lian asked whether they wanted to explore the academy with him. Yet Chen Ping'an responded no, while Pei Qian was too busy transcribing texts to pay any attention to him. Zhu Lian then walked over to knock on Shi Ro's door. Shi Ro was feeling uncomfortable and in a poor mood. And this was only made worse by Zhu Lian standing outside her room and uttering strange and vulgar words in a seemingly sophisticated manner. In the end, Shi Rou responded by telling him to piss off. And thus, Zhu Lian had no option but to explore the academy by himself. It was entirely possible that Li Baoping was already more familiar with the capital than the residents who had grown up here and lived here their entire lives. She had been to the Heaven Longevity Gate, a gate located in the south that the residents referred to as the Grain Gate. After food and grain arrived here along the transport river, everything would be examined and verified by officials from the Ministry of Revenue before being moved into the granaries. The Heaven Longevity Gate was the gathering point of all grains. Li Baoping would often squat near the shipping dock for several hours at a time and gaze at the busily working officials and petty officials. Of course, there were also the sweating physical laborers who carried things back and forth. The young girl was also aware of the existence of a popular fox immortal shrine near the same area. This wasn't an official shrine recognized by the imperial court of the government, nor was it an illegal temple targeted by the government. Its origin and background were strange, and there was a lush and seemingly fresh foxtail enshrined in the immortal shrine. There was a slightly crazy and mysterious old lady who sold charmed water, and an old man who claimed to be a bone-appraising master from someplace to the west of the Great Sui nation. The old man and the old lady often argued with each other. Li Baoping had also visited the bustling temple fair hosted by the Lasting Fortune Temple, and she was extremely interested in a pipe snake made from bull horns. Many wealthy people attended the temple fair, and they brought with them servants who appeared even more arrogant and haughty than ordinary young masters. These people liked to wear leather jackets and mink fur coats. She had also explored the perimeters of the imperial palace, and she had squatted there for many afternoons before realizing that many carriage bearers, embroiderers, and other people who weren't members of the palace, could enter the palace as well. They simply needed to carry a certain pendant on their waist. Inside the palace was a place called the Wenhua Hall where people recorded and compiled the history of the previous dynasties, and this hall had recruited many calligraphers and papermakers who were also allowed to enter the palace. Walking around the perimeter of the imperial palace and arriving at the back entrance in the north, one would find themselves at the Long Earth Gate, a place that Li Baoping visited more frequently because of its bustling nature. One time she had witnessed a noisy incident at a silver shop, with soldiers rushing in and aggressively apprehending some thieves. Li Baoping had asked a nearby shopkeeper about this incident afterward, and only then did she learn that the silver shop had been doing dirty business and making a huge fortune as a result. The silver shop was a meeting point to sell stolen goods, with most of these goods being imperial wares and perfumes that were stolen from the palace of the Great Sui nation. In fact, even some tiles used for repairing a palace building had been stolen and sold. At the same time, scrap materials from ongoing repairs in the palace were also coveted by many illegal merchants. In the same vein, lost materials and damaged materials reported by the construction office would become huge moneymakers for the illegal merchants, especially if they were works of gold or jade. It was very easy to smuggle these materials out of the imperial palace and sell them for gold and silver. Li Baoping had been quite puzzled at the time. How did people dare to steal from the imperial palace right under the emperor's nose? The shopkeeper with whom she had become familiar had smiled and replied, "This is only normal. People will engage in trades that lead to beheadings, but people won't engage in trades that lead to losses." Li Baoping had also visited the embroidered garment bridge, which wasn't far away from the Long Earth Gate. There was a large lake over there, yet the lake was completely surrounded and blocked off by the courtyard walls that belonged to the numerous nobles, ministers, and officials. The infantry commander's office was located near the lake in a place called Mink Hat Alley, and Li Baoping had walked past it several times when enjoying some desserts. This was because a classmate whom she didn't really like always bragged about his father being the highest-ranking official in the infantry commander's office. Not only that, but thanks to his father's position, no one would stop him even if he rode on the stone lions outside and pissed on their bodies. In addition, Li Baoping had also been to Eunuch Alley located in the southern region of the capital. This was a place where many elderly eunuchs and court ladies went to enjoy their old age after leaving the imperial palace. There were many Buddhist temples and Taoist temples in the area, yet they were all relatively small in size. The elderly eunuchs and court ladies were the main worshippers, and a significant number of them were extremely devout and generous with their donations. Because of this, Li Baoping could often see hunchbacked elders being assisted by servants or walking alone with canes as they visited the temples to offer incense. After visiting Eunuch Alley numerous times, Li Baoping learned that the most experienced court ladies would be referred to as inner court grandmas. These were elderly court ladies who served the emperor and empress, and among them would be a few who helped the emperor brush his hair every morning. These individuals would enjoy the greatest honor, with some of them even being bestowed the title of madam. In the east of the capital was the largest market of the capital. There were countless shops and stalls, and endless lines of people and carriages would bring with them an endless flow of money. In this market were many bookshops that Li Baoping liked to visit and wander around the most, and some daring owners of these bookshops would secretly sell books that were banned from export by the imperial court of the nation. Even so, envoys from vassal states would often send their servants to these places to secretly purchase the books banned from export. If they were unlucky, they might come across patrol squads and be thrown into prison to face punishment. During the past 3 years, regardless of whether it was a jacket or a long skirt, there would always be a young girl dressed in bright red assisting the old and slow worshippers to the temples and helping the children who were bawling under the trees to retrieve their paper kites from the tall branches. When ox-drawn carts filled with firewood became stuck on the snowy roads, she would also stand beside the poorly dressed old cart drivers and push the carts with them. She had watched elderly people playing Go at the corners of streets and alleys, and had stood on her tippy toes in an antique shop and inquired about the prices of those ornaments and curios for the study. She had sat on the steps under a bridge to listen to the storytellers tell their tales, and she had brushed past countless peddlers while walking along the streets and alleys. She had even pulled some fighting children aside and helped them to settle their differences. The young girl had listened to the squawking pigeons flying above the capital, and had looked at the beautiful paper kites hovering in the sky. She had eaten what she thought was the most delicious wonton in the world, and had sheltered from the rain under some eaves. She had escaped the scorching sunlight by hiding in the tree shade, and had breathed into her hands to warm herself when walking through wind and snow. Today, Li Baoping had run off to wander around the bookshops again. While heading over, she had eaten lunch at a small restaurant that sold cheap but delicious food. While returning, she had gone to a noodle shop in some alley. The elderly shopkeeper and his wife were both very familiar with little Baoping, so they often offered discounts or even offered free food altogether. However, Li Baoping never agreed to this, only saying that she might accept their offer next time. However, time and time again, the young girl never accepted the noodle shop's discounts. After a while, the shopkeeper simply regarded this as the young girl being polite and not willing to see their small business lose a few copper coins. However, both he and his wife actually wanted to laugh. Little Baoping was such an adorable and understanding customer, so they definitely wouldn't be annoyed at losing a few copper coins regardless of how difficult it was to earn money. Evening arrived, and Li Baoping's sprinting figure raced down the streets and alleys and appeared on the street outside Mountain Cliff Academy. People often said that time traveled quickly, yet the young girl felt saying wasn't exactly correct. Why did she feel like time was passing super slowly, so much so that she was feeling increasingly impatient? A young girl wearing a long red skirt seemed to only have the distance in her eyes as she sprinted into the academy after quickly greeting the old scholar guarding the academy gate. The napping old scholar suddenly remembered something, and he shouted at the disappearing figure of the young girl. "Come back here, little Baoping." Li Baoping didn't stop moving, and she waved her arms around and ran on the spot for a moment before turning around to look at the old scholar as she started to run in reverse. Even though she was running backward, she was surprisingly still very quick. After running back to the entrance and standing still, Li Baoping asked, "Is something the matter, Mr. Liang? You didn't come across an old friend on the way back?" The old scholar asked in curiosity. Li Baoping widened her eyes and shook her head, replying, "No, I didn't." The old scholar smiled and asked, "Did you not return from Kogon Grass Street today?" Li Baoping nodded and replied, "That's correct. Is something wrong?" Mr. Liang smiled with squinted eyes and said, "Baoping, before I answer your question, let me ask you a question first. Do you feel like I'm very knowledgeable?" Little Baoping pondered for a moment before replying, "Slightly less knowledgeable than Mountain Master Mao." The old scholar almost choked upon hearing this honest reply from the young girl. Thinking about this reply from another angle, however, little Baoping was comparing him to the Confucian sage of an academy. That being the case, these could be regarded as words of praise, no? Thus, Mr. Liang was in a fairly good mood as he told Li Baoping that a young man had come to the academy to look for her. He had stood at the entrance for quite a long time before, following which he went to a guest room to put down his luggage. He had then come to the entrance 2 more times, the last of which was around 1 hour ago. He stood at the entrance and didn't return inside the academy. He smiled and continued, I told the young man that there was no need to be impatient, seeing that little Baoping is so familiar with the capital that roaming around the city is like roaming around at home. I told him that you definitely wouldn't get lost. Even so, he still insisted on pacing back and forth along this street, so much so that even I started to become anxious for him. I told him that you often return from Kogon Grass Street, so it's very likely that he's waiting there for you right now. Since he didn't see you, it's possible that he's ventured further forward in the hopes of coming across you earlier. Because of this, the 2 of you have coincidentally missed each other. However, this doesn't matter. Just wait here for a moment, and it's guaranteed that he'll return very soon. Li Baoping immediately turned around and was just about to sprint off. However, Mr. Liang hurriedly exclaimed, Little Baoping, are you heading to Kogon Grass Street to look for him? What if he's already left Kogon Grass Street and started to look for you elsewhere? And what if he returns along a different path? If that happens, then the 2 of you might miss each other again. Perhaps the 2 of you plan to play hide and seek. Li Baoping was like a frantic ant on a griddle as she paced around in impatience. This was something that the teachers in the academy had never seen before. Little Baoping was on the verge of tears as she suddenly shouted, Junior uncle! The old scholar's heart jolted, and he narrowed his eyes as he looked toward the end of the street, with his aura undergoing a complete transformation at the same time. A flash of white turned into his vision from Kogon Grass Street, appearing like a streak of light as he rushed over in an instant. When the young man stopped and stood still in an elegant manner, his large white sleeves were still billowing in the air, making him appear much like an ethereal immortal. He stood in front of the young girl in red, a dazzling smile on his face as he said in a soft voice, Your junior uncle is here. Jianshan and Flying Dumpling's thoughts. Your junior uncle is here. Ah. There were many things that Li Baoping wanted to say, but after seeing Chan Ping'an, the myriad of words that were at the tip of her tongue all fell back into her tummy. Chan Ping'an motioned at Li Baoping's forehead and remarked, You've grown a lot taller. Li Baoping jumped up and said with a glum expression, Junior uncle, how are you growing taller even quicker than me? I can't catch up to you anymore. Chan Ping'an helped Li Baoping wipe the tears from her face. Yet the young girl suddenly stepped forward and embraced him. Chan Ping'an was caught by surprise, and he had no option but to lightly embrace Li Baoping as well, smiling knowingly as he did so. By the looks of it, she had grown up quite a bit. Upon seeing this, Mr. Liang felt, how should one put it? It was as if he were appreciating the most refreshing and warming picture scroll in the world. It was like a gentle spring breeze brushing past the willow trees. And it was like the lush green mountains standing beside the limpid blue water. There was a line from a certain poem that described this scene perfectly. A reunion in the autumn breeze and white dew, a meeting that surpasses countless in the mortal world. 1. Thus the old scholar was also fairly happy at this moment. After bidding farewell to Mr. Liang, Chan Ping'an and Li Baoping entered the academy together. Li Baoping was like an oriole chirping non-stop as she introduced the academy to Chan Ping'an. Having traveled in the cultivation world for a long time, Chan Ping'an instinctively raised his hands and was just about to cup his fists in greeting. However, he hurriedly stopped himself and bowed respectfully to the deputy mountain master of Mountain Cliff Academy like an ordinary Confucian disciple. Mao Xiaodong nodded in acknowledgement, stepping forward and saying, Chan Ping'an, let's have a chat. They left the 12-year-old Li Baoping and the 11-year-old Pei Qian in front of the guest rooms. One was dressed in a long red skirt, while one was still a tanned young girl. Li Baoping looked at Pei Qian, and the latter didn't know where to place her hands and feet. She lowered her head, not daring to catch Li Baoping's gaze. Li Baoping walked around Pei Qian before returning to her original spot and asking, So you're Pei Qian? Junior uncle told me that you're his opening disciple, and that the 2 of you have traveled a very long distance together. Pei Qian nodded and hung her head. Junior uncle also said that you're very smart and very talented at martial arts. You're also able to endure hardships just like I was back in the day. And your biggest dream is to travel around the cultivation world on a small donkey in the future. Little Baoping asked. Pei Qian raised her head and glanced at Li Baoping before once again lowering her head and nodding in response. Li Baoping pondered for a moment before saying, "All right, then let me give you 2 meeting gifts. Come with me." Pei Qian gulped in apprehension, not daring to move at all. Even though Pei Qian knew that this big sister who liked to wear red definitely wasn't a bad person, she was still afraid of following her into a dark alley and being bundled into a sack. Afterward, Li Baoping might toss her into some corner of the capital outside the academy. Li Baoping had already turned around and run several steps away, yet upon turning around and seeing Pei Qian standing there like a wooden puppet, she said in an understanding voice, "Junior uncle told me quite a bit about you, including that you're easily scared. All right, you can stick the yellow paper talisman on your forehead before coming with me." Pei Qian hurriedly retrieved a treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman and slapped it on her forehead, and only then could she muster enough courage to slowly trundle forward. Li Baoping's footsteps were extremely quick, yet in order to accommodate Pei Qian's slower speed, she could only take very small strides while swinging her arms in an exaggerated motion. She ran backward to Pei Qian's side and said, "Pei Qian, you're Junior uncle's opening disciple. So, even if this place is unfamiliar and you're afraid of encountering unfamiliar people, you still have to pretend that you're very brave and unworried. In any case, no one will dare to bully you with me around. You can rest assured about this." Pei Qian squeezed out a smile and retrieved a Yang Energy Illumination talisman, handing it to Li Baoping. This was as expected of someone with flimsy convictions and swaying loyalty. She wanted to ingratiate herself with Li Baoping before considering anything else. As for her bold claims about challenging Li Baoping from before, she had forgotten all about these things already. However, Pei Qian immediately felt slightly regretful after doing this, afraid that she would be looked down on by Li Baoping. To her surprise, Li Baoping accepted the talisman and put some saliva on the edges before loudly slapping it on her forehead and roaring with hearty laughter. Pei Qian also laughed along with her. Pei Qian had even managed to see through the concealment ability used by the old ancestor of Peace and Tranquility Mountain back then, so it was only natural that she could see through the fluctuations of a person's heart. Some people's hearts were pitch black like a ball of ink, while some people's hearts were mushy and without any firm convictions. For example, Shuro's heart was like lashing wind and rain, and it was extremely difficult for people to notice that small golden seed that was just starting to sprout with a tiny hint of green. As for Zhu Lian, his heart was particularly terrifying, being a mix of sanguinary wind and rain along with booming thunder and flashing lightning. However, she could vaguely see a beautiful pagoda that radiated with extravagance. On the other hand, some people's hearts were as clear as limpid water. For example, this big sister who was wearing a long red skirt. Thus, Pei Qian felt particularly embarrassed and ashamed when interacting with her. Seeing that Pei Qian wasn't walking very quickly, Li Baoping abandoned her plan to sprint back to the dorms. Instead, she matched Pei Qian's snail-like pace and casually asked, "I heard Junior Uncle mention that you guys came across Cui Dongshan? Did he bully you?" Pei Qian didn't dare to tell the truth, replying that everything went okay. Li Baoping pretended to grab something and breathe over it, saying, "This person isn't punished enough. Don't worry, I'll give him a good beating for you when he returns to the academy." Pei Qian turned around and stole a glance at Li Baoping. She felt immense admiration for this big sister. Apart from her master, who wasn't afraid of Cui Dongshan. From Old Man Wei to Little Bai, the 4 martial artists from the Lotus Flower Blessed Land were all afraid of him. Big Sister Shuro was afraid of him as well, and even that Earth Bull was no exception. As for Pei Qian, she was even more afraid of him. It was as if there were a dark and gigantic pool of immense depth in Cui Dongshan's heart. However, this wasn't a pool of stagnant and lifeless water, and there was instead the vague shadow of a flood dragon, a creature that Pei Qian had read about in the books and seen on the painting scrolls. The shadow was swimming around slowly, and each time the flood dragon approached the surface of the water, it would give rise to ripples that sent cold chills through one's body. Fortunately, there were stacks of gold and silver books resting beside the deep pool, making the entire scene appear less eerie and petrifying. Otherwise, Pei Qian wouldn't have dared to interact with Cui Dongshan. The tall and sturdy old man had a teacher's ruler hanging by his waist, and he was none other than Mao Xiaodong, the legitimate backbone of Mountain Cliff Academy. Mao Xiaodong led Qian Ping into his study, making almost no small talk with the young man as they walked. After the two of them sat down, the stern expression on Mao Xiaodong's face was suddenly replaced with a wide smile. He then stood up and surprisingly bowed in respect to Qian Pingyan. Qian Pingyan hurriedly stood up and stepped to the side, thinking that he most definitely didn't deserve this unexpected expression of respect. Mao Xiaodong smiled and said, "If it weren't for you acting as a Dao guardian back then, the scholarly lineage of Mountain Cliff Academy would have taken a huge hit." Qian Pingyan didn't know how to respond. There were too many people around just then, so it wasn't a suitable place to discuss these sensitive matters. Mao Xiaodong explained. "Junior brother, I've been waiting for you for a very long time." Qian Pingyan smiled wryly and was just about to say something. However, Mao Xiaodong waved his hand and said, "There's no need to say anything, it's fine as long as we both understand." Qian Pingyan felt slightly helpless as he sat down. Mao Xiaodong smiled faintly as he looked Qian Pingyan up and down, and he extended a hand and said, "Junior brother, let me see your travel documents so I can broaden my horizons." Qian Pingyan stood up and handed his travel documents to Mao Xiaodong with both hands. After accepting the document, Mao Xiaodong smiled and said, "I still need to thank Junior brother for subduing that little bastard in Cui Dongshan. If he weren't worried about you suddenly visiting the academy one day, it was entirely possible that he could have turned East Mountain and the capital of the Great Sui nation on their heads. In reality, Cui Dongshan is still apprehensive of the scholarly sage. His worries have little to do with me," Qian Pingyan replied. Mao Xiaodong pointed at Qian Pingyan and remarked, "Junior brother, your response is almost identical to what our teacher was like back then. The greater his feat, the more modest he would act in front of us, his disciples. Oh, it wasn't anything impressive, it was just a minor matter. I didn't do anything much at all, and I simply said a few words. You guys should stop flattering me as if I've done something major to benefit the entire world. It's not like your teacher has won a debate against the Tao ancestor or Buddha, so why are you guys acting so emotional and overjoyed? What, perhaps you didn't think that I would win? And that's why you're so pleasantly surprised now? Mao Xiaodong, you're smiling the most, so get out of here and face your punishment with Zui Yu. Both of you can stand in the courtyard and recite some texts. When Zui Yu secretly climbs over the wall to sneak away, remember to remind him that he should also bring some midnight snacks back for little Qi. Seeing that little Qi is growing up right now, tell him that the snacks shouldn't be too greasy, or else the smell will keep us all awake at night." Mao Xiaodong laughed heartily as he recounted this interaction with his teacher back then. Qian Pingyan could feel a headache forming. Why was it that speaking with Mao Xiaodong appeared even more difficult than speaking with Cui Dongshan? Just then I heard Mr. Liang say that Lin Shuyi is very outstanding and that there's nothing to worry about. However, Li Huai has been performing quite badly in his studies. Does Li Huai get tired from studying too much? Qian Pingyan asked. Mao Xiaodong smiled faintly and replied, "With Li Huai's incredible sense of optimism, he'll continue to lie on the ground and play with his painted wooden puppet and clay statues even if the sky starts to collapse. In fact, he might even feel happy about the fact that he won't need to go to class and listen to the rambling of the teachers anymore. You don't need to worry about Li Huai. He's at the bottom of the class each time, but he never eats less or drinks less because of this. His parents and older sister also visited the academy some time ago, and they left him some silver coins that he hasn't spent flagrantly. However, there was one time when a teacher on night patrol duty caught him and his two roommates drinking water as a replacement for wine and chowing down on large drumsticks. Little Huai was still burping when they were forced to stand as punishment and be slapped on the palms with rulers, and the teacher asked him whether the drumstick tasted better or the ruler tasted better. Guess what Li Huai said? Qian Pingyan suppressed his smile and replied, "If facing the ruler means being able to eat drumsticks, then the ruler also tastes very good. However, I presume that Li Huai was able to eat rulers until he was full after saying that." Mao Xiaodong raised a thumb and said, "As expected of junior brother who accompanied them here from the Great Li Empire. Sure enough, you're the one who understands Li Huai best." He then smiled and continued, Even though Li Huai is slow to pick up new knowledge, this isn't an indication of him being stupid. Many children his age only know how to memorize books, whereas Li Huai is genuinely able to transform the knowledge into his own after he understands it. Because of this, the teachers actually have a very good impression of Li Huai. Even though his results are always bottom of the class, the teachers never scold him too much regarding this fact. Even so, we should still encourage Li Huai to study diligently and not slack off, Chen Ping'an said in an uncertain voice. There was a look of approval and encouragement in Mao Xiaodong's eyes as he replied, "That's indeed the case." Li Er had only just rampaged through the imperial palace at that time, causing everyone to be scared out of their wits. The teachers are indeed fond of Li Huai to begin with, but it's also true that they're afraid of Li Er being too protective of his son. As a result, there was a period of time when they didn't dare to scold him at all. However, I gave those teachers a good lecture, and everything was able to return to normal after that. They scold Li Huai when they need to, and they also give him physical punishment when it's called for. This should be the normal relationship between teachers and students. Did Li Huai and the others suffer any detrimental after effects that they weren't able to detect themselves after that commotion? Chen Ping'an asked. Mao Xiaodong smiled and replied, "There's me looking after the academy, and at worst, there's still Cui Dongshan who's filled with evil schemes overlooking the academy, so those people weren't able to cause any trouble. In any case, these things are unavoidable, and they can also be regarded as part of seeking knowledge, understanding etiquette, and obtaining knowledge from the books. There's no need to be overly worried about it. I'm adjusting to all kinds of situations and not going to the extremes. However, this will make things more tiring for Mountain Master Mao," Chen Ping'an said. There was a look of slight displeasure on Mao Xiaodong's face as he grumbled. "Is it really that difficult to call me senior brother Mao? What's wrong? Perhaps you feel like I'm far inferior to Qi Jingchen and Zui Yu, and I might even be inferior to Cui Dongshan? Is that why you're unwilling to call me senior brother Mao?" Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, "No, that's not the case. Please forgive me, Mountain Master Mao." This pertained to their scholarly lineage, so it wasn't an area where Chen Ping'an could relent and be polite. Mao Xiaodong appeared displeased on the surface, yet he was actually nodding in his mind. If Chen Ping'an were a young man who would sway left and right at the behest of him, the so-called sage of Mountain Cliff Academy, then he would most definitely still have the right to refer to him as senior brother Mao. However, he wouldn't necessarily have the right to be the scholarly sage's closing disciple and Qi Jingchen and Zui Yu's junior brother. This seemingly trivial exchange revealed much about Chen Ping'an's personality. Mao Xiaodong was astute enough to assess these matters. Of the scholarly sage's 4 direct disciples back then, his opening disciple Cui Chan had been the most knowledgeable and talented across a broad spectrum of topics. Qi Jingchen had possessed the most profound knowledge, while Zui Yu, who advocated for walking along the path of the Great Tao alone, had been a late bloomer who possessed the highest cultivation base. Apart from them, there had also been someone who had appeared clumsy and slow on the surface, yet was the scholarly sage's favorite disciple apart from Qi Jingchen. Following the conclusion of the battle between the 3rd and 4th sages, however, the once soaring scholarly lineage of the scholarly sage had gradually started to wane. At that time, only the seemingly clumsy disciple had accompanied the scholarly sage the entire time, accompanying him all the way until he imprisoned himself in the forest of virtue. Meanwhile, Mao Xiaodong couldn't be regarded as outstanding even among the unofficial disciples of the scholarly sage. From this, it was abundantly clear just how lofty and dazzling the scholarly lineage of the scholarly sage was back then. Mao Xiaodong felt a slight sense of melancholy. Greatness was always prone to dissipating in the wind and rain. When Qi Jingchen had left the Middle-earth Divine Continent and traveled to the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent to found Mountain Cliff Academy, many outsiders had speculated that Qi Jingchen was trying to suppress and deter Cui Chan, his former senior brother who had betrayed the scholarly sage. However, Mao Xiaodong knew that this wasn't the case. Zui Yu had been even more resolute, and he had directly distanced himself from the mortal world and set off to sea alone to look for immortals. The seemingly stupid disciple who rumors claimed to be the only person who could rival Aoyang had also fallen silent for 100 or so years. Mao Xiaodong pushed these complicated thoughts aside and eventually turned his gaze to Chen Ping'an. Now, their master had taken a closing disciple who would inherit the knowledge of the scholarly lineage. In the 3 years after Chen Ping'an had passed the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy but not entered, Mao Xiaodong had felt both curious and anxious about this final disciple of his master. Just what kind of scholarly talent was he? Would this young man from the jewel small world disappoint them and fail to live up to Qi Jingquan's high hopes? However, when Mao Xiaodong had used the sagely mystical powers unique to the mountain master to observe Chen Ping'an's speech and actions from a distance, he had seen nothing breathtaking and nothing disappointing either. He had simply felt like Chen Ping'an, someone from an impoverished background, was indeed the type of disciple whom his teacher would take. He was indeed a junior brother whom Qi Jingquan would be willing to take as a disciple on behalf of the scholarly sage. Afterward, Chen Ping'an carefully asked about Lin Shui's cultivation and studies, and whether the two things would clash with each other. He also asked about the friendship between Gao Xian and Yu Lu, voicing his worries about the friendship not being pure and sincere enough. With Xie having become Cui Dongshan's maidservant, Chen Ping'an also asked whether her mental state would be detrimentally affected. Mao Xiaodong answered all of Chen Ping'an's questions, not forgetting to flip through his travel documents from time to time. Chen Ping'an finally breathed a sigh of relief after roughly learning about the situation. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. In the end, Mao Xiaodong smiled and asked, "You need to think so much about both yourself and other people, so do you not find this tiring?" "Not at all." Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied honestly. Mao Xiaodong nodded and said in a soft voice, "The same principles apply regardless of whether one is studying, practicing martial arts, or practicing sword techniques. It's important to gather momentum for all of these tasks. Noble people will be able to achieve great success if they come across good opportunities. Yet they'll have to hide themselves like dragons and snakes if no good opportunity presents itself. Thus, some peculiar ideas and fantastical thoughts will be like dazzling literary works from another world, never seen and never obtained by the world before." Chen Ping'an felt was a very bold statement, so he couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Mao Xiaodong suddenly lowered his voice and asked, "Did Master ever mention me?" Chen Ping'an wanted to respond, yet he couldn't help but hesitate. In the end he replied honestly, "I don't think he ever mentioned you." Mao Xiaodong slapped his knee and huffed. How can there be such a partial master in the world? He wasn't willing to give up and he asked, "Think carefully again. Perhaps you missed something." Chen Ping'an resolutely shook his head. Mao Xiaodong stroked his beard and smiled, saying with absolute confidence, "Master is thinking about me in his mind, so he naturally doesn't need to mention me all the time." Chen Ping'an felt much more reassured after hearing this. Mountain Master Mao was definitely a disciple taught by the scholarly sage. Most likely because she felt like Li Baoping was a relatively easygoing person, Pei Qian's footsteps gradually became quicker and more nimble. After Pei Qian arrived at Li Baoping's dorm and saw the mountains of transcriptions on the 3 empty beds, however, she almost fell to her knees and kowtowed to Li Baoping. No wonder Li Baoping had replied with a simple nod after Pei Qian summoned her courage to show off slightly just then, saying that she completed transcriptions every single day. Pei Qian initially thought that she had clawed back some ground, causing her to feel a little smug and allowing her to stand a little straighter. Li Baoping poured a cup of tea for Pei Qian and told her to sit wherever she wanted. Meanwhile, she climbed onto her bed and retrieved her small bamboo bookcase, moving it to the table. She then took out the saber, auspicious talisman, as well as the small silver gourd that Aoyang had given her. "Here, a gift for you," Li Baoping said. Pei Qian glanced at the saber and the small gourd. She was relatively good at appraising items now, so she looked up at Li Baoping and asked a redundant question saying, "These are very, very expensive, right?" Li Baoping didn't purposely hide anything from Pei Qian, replying, "I heard Aoyang mention that the quality of the saber, auspicious talisman, is only a so-so. It's a pseudo-celestial tool or whatnot. This small gourd that I swindled from Wind Snow Temple's sword immortal Wei Jin is better, and it's one of the 7 sword nurturing gourds that the Dao ancestor personally raised when he was cultivating in a thatched cottage in the past. Sword immortals will become more powerful if they nurture their flying swords with these gourds. Pei Qian, haven't you started to practice sword techniques already? Here you can use this gourd." Pei Qian's tongue was already tied in a knot, and she said in a muffled voice, "But I've only just started to practice sword techniques. My skills are very mediocre." And I'm not a sword cultivator who possesses bonded flying swords or anything. I'm also quite slow, so I might not be able to nurture anything in my lifetime. Pei Qian timidly nodded in response. Li Baoping scratched her head and sighed in her mind. How had junior uncle found such a slow and silly disciple? Pei Qian felt increasingly uneasy, and she glanced at the mountains of transcriptions on the bed as well as the saber and the silver sword nurturing gourd on the table. A brilliant thought suddenly occurred to her, and she said in a soft voice, "Big Sister Baoping, I don't dare to accept such valuable gifts. Master will scold me if I do." Li Baoping blinked and replied, "Then just tell your master that I'm lending these things to you. It doesn't matter if you borrow it for 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, or 1,000 years. It's still borrowing at the end of the day, and it's not like I'll ask for them back either. That way you can feel at ease and use them while you travel through the cultivation world. Isn't that right?" Pei Qian hung her head and replied, "Yeah, you're right." Little Baoping shifted to a different spot, sitting down on the chair beside Pei Qian as she consoled, "Don't feel like you're stupid. You're still young after all. And I heard junior uncle say that you're 1 year younger than me." Pei Qian felt made a lot of sense, so she immediately raised her head and started to smile. She then rested her arms and chin on the table and asked in a careful voice, "Big Sister Baoping, can I touch them?" Li Baoping suddenly stood up, giving Pei Qian a huge fright. After signaling with her eyes for Pei Qian to feel at ease, she gestured for the tanned young girl to watch carefully. However, what Pei Qian saw was Li Baoping rapidly unsheathing the sword and grabbing the hilt with both hands before taking a deep breath and slashing down at the silver gourd. Pei Qian was completely stunned. Li Baoping's strike was relatively domineering, yet the smooth surface of the silver gourd caused it to slip and shoot toward Pei Qian, who instinctively slapped it away. The silver gourd smacked into Li Baoping's face with a loud thwack. There was a thud as the silver gourd fell to the floor. Li Baoping was momentarily dazed, and blood started to trickle from her nose. Pei Qian felt like she was dead meat. Li Baoping was still holding auspicious talisman right now, so it was very likely that her next strike would be at her neck, right? However, Li Baoping unexpectedly raised a hand and casually wiped it across her nose. She then adeptly sheathed the saber and used the tip of her foot to flick the sword nurturing gourd into her hand. After doing this, she returned both the saber and the silver gourd to the table. After sitting down, Li Baoping smiled happily and said, "Pei Qian, your block and slap were beautifully done just then. You looked much like a cultivator from the cultivation world. Not bad, as expected of junior uncle's disciple." There was a woeful look on Pei Qian's face as she pointed at Li Baoping's nose and said in a daze, "Big Sister Baoping, your nose is still bleeding." Li Baoping wiped her nose again, and looking down at her palm, it appeared like she was indeed suffering a nosebleed. She calmly stood up and ran over to her bed, pulling out a piece of calligraphy paper from the large scroll and ripping off 2 strips. After rolling them into balls, she tilted her head backward and stuffed the balls into her nose, after which she casually sat back down next to Pei Qian. Pei Qian's face was as white as a sheet, and this greatly confused Li Baoping. What was going on? Why did it seem like the silver gourd had smacked Pei Qian's face instead of her face? In any case, it wouldn't hurt even if it had smacked Pei Qian's face. Li Baoping rubbed her chin and carefully looked the tanned young girl up and down. She felt like junior uncle's disciple had a relatively strange way of thinking, so much so that even she, Li Baoping, couldn't understand her. As expected of junior uncle's opening disciple. Sure enough, there was something special about her. Pei Qian suppressed the pain in her heart as she hesitantly retrieved her beloved small gourd from her sleeve and placed it on the table. Gently pushing it toward Li Baoping, she said, "Big Sister Baoping, this is a gift for you. You can also treat it as an apology from me." Li Baoping was slightly angry at Pei Qian for being overly polite and treating her as an outsider, so she shot a glare at her and instructed, "Take it back." Pei Qian quickly and obediently placed the small gourd back inside her sleeve. After leaving Mao Xiaodong's study, the lingering rays of evening sunshine were about to vanish for good as Chen Ping'an went to look for Li Huai, who was theoretically in class right now. Chen Ping'an stood outside the window of the classroom and immediately saw the little boy sitting there with his book held high up. Hiding behind the book, Li Huai was nodding off with his head bobbing up and down. There were 2 children the same age as Li Huai sitting beside him, and one was filled with vigor and energy and clearly unable to sit still. His eyes were wandering around, and he had noticed Chun Ping'an standing outside the classroom a long time ago. The two of them stared at each other. The other child was sitting upright and listening to the teacher with full concentration. Lu Guan noticed the young man in white smiling and looking in his direction the entire time, and he knew that this person definitely wasn't a teacher of the academy given how young he was. Thus, he silently punched his palm in an act of provocation. However, the teacher immediately bellowed, "Lu Guan!" Lu Guan obediently stood up. Li Huai was enjoying a beautiful dream, yet he was scared out of his wits and woken with a start at this moment, causing him to put down his book and look around with a dazed expression. The teacher immediately roared, "And you as well, Li Huai? Transcribe exhortation to learning 5 times tonight. 1. Also, you're not allowed to ask Ma Lian to help you." After class, the teacher walked out of the classroom with a stern expression. He nodded in acknowledgement to Chun Ping'an, whom he had noticed a long time ago. Chun Ping'an bowed in response. Li Huai widened his eyes after walking out of the boisterous classroom, and he was barely able to believe what he was seeing. "Chun Ping'an!" he exclaimed. Chun Ping'an smiled faintly and waved at the little boy. Li Huai grinned widely before suddenly shouting, "Chun Ping'an, have a taste of Grandmaster Li's invincible fist technique." After shouting this, Li Huai clumsily performed the 6-step walking meditation and charged at Chun Ping'an. However, Chun Ping'an reached over and placed a hand on his head, holding him at bay. Li Luai flailed around for a long while before finally calming down. The rims of his eyes were red as he asked, "Chun Ping'an, why did you come here so late? My big sister left a long time ago. If you had come earlier, you would have been able to meet her. With my help matching the two of you together, you could have then made eyes at each other and eventually become a lovey-dovey couple. You could have done some romantic things in the academy under the moonlight and willow branches, and I would have been able to call you brother-in-law now." Chun Ping'an didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Li Huai grabbed Chun Ping'an's arm before turning to Lu Guan and Ma Lian and saying with a smile, "He's Chun Ping'an, the Chun Ping'an who gave me the bamboo bookcase and made me a pair of straw sandals. What did I tell you? That he would definitely come to the academy to visit me. What do you say? Do you believe me now?" Lu Guan rolled his eyes in response. So this was the Chun Ping'an that Li Huai talked about so much that he had calluses in his ears? Ma Lian hurriedly bowed in greeting. Li Huai laughed in an unrestrained manner, yet he stopped abruptly and asked, "Have you seen Li Baoping yet?" Chun Ping'an nodded and replied, "Yes, I saw her at the entrance of the academy." Li Huai nodded earnestly and said, "Let's go and look for Li Baoping together in a moment. She still needs to thank me for inviting you to the academy. She wanted to beat me up at the mountain peak back then, but, how can a little girl run faster than me? What an absolute joke. I've mastered the divine techniques now, and I'm able to run like the wind and fly across eaves and walls." Chun Ping'an coughed quietly. Li Huai suddenly noticed Lu Guan's gloating expression and Ma Lian squirming around, so he slowly turned around, only to see Li Baoping standing behind him with a tanned young girl. Li Huai immediately felt a sense of connection with the tanned young girl, especially since she looked a little like Chun Ping'an had back during their first encounter in the small town. Li Baoping crossed her arms and said with a cold chuckle, "Li Huai, I'll give you a head start of 100 paces and it's your choice whether you hide in a tree, on a roof, or in the toilet." Li Huai huffed and replied, "Li Baoping, seeing that Chun Ping'an genuinely came to the academy, how about we settle things and call this a draw?" "A draw?" Li Baoping asked with a smile. Li Huai thought for a moment before relenting and saying, "Fine, then we'll call this a close loss for me?" Seeing that her junior uncle was indeed present, Li Baoping decided to let things slide this time. It didn't look like Li Baoping was going to beat him up, so Li Huai immediately regained his haughty spirit and dragged Chun Ping'an by the arm, asking in happiness, "Where are you staying right now? Do you want to visit my dorm first?" Pei Qian's eyes lit up. By the looks of it, this Li Huai was a like-minded person. In the end, they walked to Chun Ping'an's guest room together. In reality, Ma Lian really wanted to tag along with Li Huai. However, Lu Guan forcefully dragged him away to eat dinner together. Zhu Lian was yet to return from his exploration. Shiro stayed in her guest room the entire time and didn't meet anyone else. This was a Confucian academy after all. Even if one were a legitimate Earth immortaline entity, Would one dare to act flagrantly in such an area? Shuro felt like she was desecrating the academy with each inhale and exhale, and this made her feel an incredible sense of guilt, respect, and fear. This was the majestic world. Meanwhile, Chan Ping'an, Li Baoping, Pei Qian, and Li Huai were sitting around a table together. They were enjoying a meal prepared for the guest rooms by the academy. Li Huai was sitting opposite Chan Ping'an and talking the loudest. With Chan Ping'an present and overlooking the situation, he naturally didn't need to be afraid of Li Baoping. Chan Ping'an, do you want to look for Lin Shui together afterward? Li Huai asked. It's extremely difficult to catch him now, and he's absolutely living it up at the moment. He always ventures outside the academy to travel around and enjoy himself. I'm so envious of him. Chan Ping'an smiled and replied, It's evening right now, and this is a period of time that Qi refiners treat with relative importance. It's best that we don't disturb him at this time, and I can look for him later at night. There's no need for you to lead the way either, and I can look for Lin Shui by myself. When it came to cultivating the great Tao, each sliver of opportunity needed to be seized. Some cultivation practices were universal. For example, there were 4 periods of the day when one couldn't slack off. Heaven and earth were clear at midnight, so this period of time was best for internal observation and producing qi, using one's bridge of immortality to link one's internal small world to the large world outside. The period of time before sunrise was best for nurturing and channeling qi, bringing benefits to both one's acupoints and meridians. Noon was the best time for using yang energy to refine qi into liquid, while evening was the best time to transform this liquid and absorb it drop by drop into the critical residences that were located inside one's bonded acupoints, allowing one to accumulate a strong foundation of the great Tao. In addition to the 4 periods of the day, there were also practices regarding the time periods of the month and of the year. When it came to building the foundation of the great Tao, this was simply a case of working hard to repair and support one's innate foundation. This was a slow process akin to using water to polish a mirror, and as the mirror gradually became smoother and clearer, one would eventually reach the rumored state of flawlessness. Most importantly, one would gain the ability to notice extremely subtle changes after one set foot on the path of cultivation and started to ascend the mountain of the great Tao. One would clearly understand one's losses if one slacked off for a single day. Thus, it was unacceptable for cultivators to slack off. After understanding the mystical nature of these principles, many derivative rules and regulations would no longer appear confusing, as if they were shrouded in clouds and mists. Everything would open up and become clear. For example, why weren't mortal rulers allowed to advance to the middle 5 tiers? Why did cultivators gradually distance themselves from the mortal world and become unwilling to interact with it? Why did they cultivate in blessed lands that were brimming with spiritual energy and view returning to the mortal world as a form of tempering the mind? Not only that, but returning to the mortal world was also a reluctant act that would provide no tangible benefits to their cultivation base. Moreover, why were cultivators surprisingly prohibited from leaving the mountains freely after advancing to the ascension tier? Why weren't they allowed to freely swallow up the spiritual energy and fortune of other lands? Cui Dongshan had once smiled and said that when it came to qi refiners who were seeking immortality, the higher one's cultivation base, the likelier it was for one to ignore the rules and flout social morals. If these cultivators were allowed to roam free, then the mortal world outside the mountains would start to sway precariously like a chair with a loose joint. As the overseers of the majestic world, the Confucian sages had quite an exhausting job repairing this loose joint and keeping things stable. In terms of house discipline alone, the stinky Taoist priests in the heavenly world employed the simplest solution. If a powerful cultivator became too impudent and dared to offend the Taoist orthodoxy, then an immortal in the 5 cities and 12 pagodas of the White Jade capital would receive an order from one of the pagoda masters, after which they would dash out and smack the offending cultivator to death in a single blow. Of course, there were also some powerful cultivators who managed to flee with their lives. These cultivators would then travel to the heaven ascending platform and beat the heavenly drum to express their grievances and search for justice. Looking through the history books, only the Tao ancestors' first disciple would frequently grant an audience to these cultivators and listen to their grievances, helping them resolve the situation and at the very least reducing their punishment by a small amount. In fact, there were even cases where the branch master wearing a hibiscus hat would directly exonerate the cultivators and severely punish the immortals from the White Jade capital instead. If the person judging the cultivators were Lu Chan, the Tao ancestor's youngest disciple, then everything would depend on Branchmaster Lu Chen's mood. If he were in a good mood, then everything would be smooth sailing and the cultivators might even receive a fated opportunity. If he were in a bad mood, however, then the cultivators might even receive additional punishment. If it were the Tao ancestor's second disciple overseeing the White Jade capital, then it would be impossible for anyone to beat the heavenly drums and express their grievances. This was because the Taoist second disciple would definitely lash out and kill them, most likely dragging their remnant souls into his palm, which was also the purest thunder pool in the heavenly world. The sky was boundless and the earth was vast. No matter how much a mortal human liked to travel around, they might still be unable to explore the entirety of a single nation in their lifetime. Even after becoming a cultivator, one wouldn't dare to say that they could travel around the entirety of a continent. Similarly, those who were fortunate enough to become upper 5-tier immortals wouldn't dare to say that they could travel around the entirety of all of the worlds.